It seemed like the rules written on the jade token were not to be taken exactly. It was detailed on the jade token that one would be welcomed by the teachers upon arriving at the great frontistery of Confucianism, at which point one would have a chance to choose among them. However, all that was there to welcome him upon his arrival was a mere copper gong and nothing else. Did I come so quickly that no one was able to react in time? Zhang Xian muttered under his breath. In any case, he had no intention of waiting there for them, so he proceeded ahead without any hesitation. This was his first time entering the great frontistery of Confucianism, and he was so overwhelmed by the changes in the spatial laws and the concentration in the spiritual energy that he failed to notice the crowd crushed beneath the copper gong. Besides, he had not exerted too much strength in the earlier stomp, so he did not expect that anyone would end up injured as a result of that. Thus, he had completely failed to notice the bunch of scholastic masters. It was just like how an elephant would not feel an ant struggling beneath it when stepping on it. So, shortly after Zhang Xian disappeared, Zhong Qing appeared before the copper gong. He scanned the surroundings with a confused look in his eyes, for a moment, before his eyebrows shot up in horror. He quickly grabbed the copper gong and tugged, and it took him a while before he was finally able to lug it away. A bunch of scholastic masters were imprinted messily in the ground. Their faces were ghastly pale, and fresh blood was oozing out from the corners of their mouths. Seeing that everyone was almost on their last breath, Zhong Qing exclaimed, "Mi Xian, what in the world happened here?" Those scholastic masters were the strongest experts of the great frontistery of Confucianism. They should have been the ones demonstrating their abilities to attract new students to come under their wing. But why would they end up lying beneath the copper gong like a bunch of dead fish? Did someone just decipher the seal and enter the premises? Mi Xian asked with a tearful look on his face. Yes, Fan Xiaoxu from ancient sage Ziqi's lineage. Zhong Qing replied before realization struck him, and he widened his eyes in shock. Are you saying that he was the one who caused this? Wait a moment. Tell me what happened here. With an awkward look on his face, Mi Xian began explaining. I took out my copper gong, hoping to find someone who can survive 10 breaths against it, and bring him under my wing. So when I saw that someone was entering the great frontistery of Confucianism, I swiftly brought it out to block his way. However, I didn't think that the other party would stomp down on it so forcefully. In order to prevent it from damaging the buildings around, everyone offered their strength to stop it. But, well, you can see the results for yourself. He sent the copper gong flying. Even with so many of you around, none of you were able to stop him? Zhong Qing shook his head in incredulity. But how could that be? Fan Xiaoxu is a Saint Nine Dan pinnacle cultivator. Putting aside the fact that the copper gong was a great sage artifact, it appeared that a stomp from Fan Xiaoxu was already more powerful than a dozen scholastic masters. A Saint Nine Dan pinnacle cultivator being stronger than so many great sage experts? How could that be possible? There's no way Saint Nine Dan cultivators could wield such strength, Mi Xian remarked deeply. In fact, not even great sages would be able to pull something like this off. Such strength can only be wielded by an ancient sage. Ancient sages were extremely dense in weight, such that their body seemed to harness a world in itself. With how swiftly Fan Xiaoxu had been moving earlier, if his body carried the weight of an ancient sage, he would have been able to pull something like that off with a simple stomp. Perhaps he might not even have been aware of how powerful his stomp was. In any case, one thing was for sure. There was no way a Saint Nine Dan cultivator could draw forth such strength. Hearing those words, Zhong Qing frowned. But I checked Fan Xiaoxu earlier, and he is indeed a member from ancient sage Ziqi's lineage. Fan Xiaofeng and the others can testify for him too. So it seems unlikely that he would be an impersonator. Furthermore, if an ancient sage barged into the great frontistery of Confucianism, the Great Formation would surely activate, and the hibernating ancient sages would swiftly regain consciousness. However, nothing is happening at all. Similar to the ancient sages of the Master-Teacher Pavilion headquarters, the ancient sages of the great frontistery of Confucianism spent most of their time hibernating. It was only in the presence of those who wielded strength equal to them would they be forcefully woken up from their long sleep. The fact that the surroundings were completely silent was more than enough to prove that there were no ancient sages who had breached the barrier and barged into the area. But if that was not the case, how were they to make sense about what had happened? No matter who Fan Xiaoxu truly is, let's find him before deciding our next move. Knowing that they would only be able to resolve the problem with the person in question present, Mi Xian quickly stowed his copper gong before flying over to the cluster of buildings. Zhong Qing and the others followed tightly behind. It did not take long before they saw a silhouette standing in the square, scratching his head in confusion. It was none other than Fan Xiaoxu. Voila! Everyone swiftly descended to the ground and surrounded Fan Xiaoxu tightly. You are. Fan Xiaoxu had a confused look on his face that seemed to say, "What am I doing here?" You are currently at the Great Frontistery of Confucianism. You cleared the examination with ease, deciphered the formation within a breath, and overpowered all of us simultaneously shortly after entering the premises. A scholastic master among the crowd could not take it anymore. Tell me, just who in the world are you? I am at the Great Frontistery of Confucianism. Cleared the examination. I have already cleared the examination? Fan Xiaoxu was taken aback as the information plunged him deeper into confusion. Furthermore, I overpowered all of you? What does that mean? Seeing how Fan Xiaoxu was acting, as if he had lost his memory, another scholastic master sneered coldly. Don't bother playing the fool. We'll know your true strength with a simple look. With a tap of his finger, a book materialized in the air. It swiftly flipped open before a ray of light descended from it. It was one of the treasures of the Great Frontistery of Confucianism, the Book of Veracity. It was able to gauge a person's true cultivation and bloodline, and there was no way to possibly deceive it. It had been created through the principles of ancient sage Bo Shang's Eye of Insight, and the book possessed the ability to dispel all falsehood. Wang, shrouded with a ray of light, the flow of Fan Xiaoxu's jinqi, the strength of his meridians, and everything else about him was clearly displayed. Even the color of his bloodline and his cultivation was visible to the eye. He's indeed from the lineage of ancient sage Ziqi, and there's no doubt that he's a Saint Nine Dan pinnacle cultivator. Hearing those words, the crowd grew even more confused. Under the inspection of the Book of Veracity, it turned out that there was no mistake about the identity of the young man before them. He was Fan Xiaoxu through and through. But could a Saint Nine Dan pinnacle cultivator really overpower all of them so thoroughly that they were unable to retaliate? Could a Saint Nine Dan cultivator decipher the formation and get in there within a single breath? Could a Saint Nine Dan cultivator teach his peers and grant them the power to eliminate over 1,000 examinees in an intense examination? Allow me to test your strength. While everyone was still trying to figure out what was going on, Zhong Qing took a step forward. This time, he suppressed his cultivation down to Great Sage 1 Dan introspective convalescence realm instead of Saint 9 Dan. Even Fan Xiaofeng and Fan Xiaoxing had been able to defeat him earlier. Considering that Fan Xiaoxu was their mentor, raising his cultivation higher than a realm would instead allow him to better control his strength, and thus prevent anyone from getting hurt. Hung Long, not giving Fan Xiaoxu any time to react, Zhong Qing smacked his palm down with the might of a falling comet and the raging tides of a river. Even though he had suppressed his cultivation to the introspective convalescence realm, the power that he displayed still made everyone's breathing hastened in alarm as they subconsciously backed away. Fan Xiaoxu's face paled in fright before this tremendous might, such that his body trembled uncontrollably. His memory only went to the point where he was still at the foot of the mountain, waiting for the examination to begin. Then when he suddenly came to again, he was already standing in this square. To make matters worse, a scholastic master even made a move against him without any hesitation. What the heck was going on? Knowing that there was no time to think in this situation, he hurriedly backed away. He could tell in an instant that the strength wielded by the other party was not something that he could possibly stand up against. If he did not dodge, there was a good chance that he would be smashed into a meat biscuit. So, however, before he could even process what was going on, his body had already flown back. It was just an instant, but his body had already flown back 800 meters, almost as if he had teleported away. Boom! Zhong Qing's attack landed on the ground, creating a depression in the middle of the square. Not expecting that he would be able to move with such swiftness, Fan Xiaoxu was stunned. What is going on? He staggered weakly on the spot, and a moment of imbalance caused him to fall on his bottom onto the ground. He had been thinking of simply retreating a single step, and under normal circumstances, it would already have been a formidable feat if he was able to retreat 10 meters away. Yet he had actually covered 800 meters in a single step. How in the world did he do it? Where am I? Who am I? Fan Xiaoxu fell into confusion once more. This movement technique. Mi Xian and the others narrowed their eyes in shock. They could tell that the person standing before them had only used the strength of an ordinary Saint 9 Dan, but a slight maneuver from him was already more than enough to outrun a great sage 1 Dan cultivator. The speed that he was able to travel at was terrifying. On the other hand, Zhong Qing was not too surprised to see that his attack had failed to land. He had been unable to defeat Fan Xiaofeng and Fan Xiaoxing when his cultivation was suppressed to the same level as them, so there was nothing surprising about the person who had groomed them being able to dodge his attack easily. Zhong Qing exhaled deeply before kicking off the ground once more. His movements were flurried and random, like a raging blizzard. No matter how Fan Xiaoxu moved around, he found that he was unable to shake Zhong Qing off his trail, leaving him feeling completely bewildered. This is the unique technique of scholastic master Zhong Qing, World of Blizzard, Mi Xian remarked grimly. Putting aside opponents of the same tier, with his current fighting prowess, he would be able to overpower even great sage 2 Dan experts with ease. Mi Xian was one of the few cultivators whose abilities were heavily skewed toward his immense might. Playing on his core strength, he capitalized on his superior might to overwhelm everything that stood in his way, so the battle techniques that he practiced tended to be simple in nature. Forming a stark contrast to him was Zhong Qing, whose expertise lay in pulling off delicate movements to pressure his opponent. The World of Blizzard, which he was executing at the moment, was incredibly confusing, such that it left one's eyes blurring in confusion. Had Mi Xian been in Fan Xiaoxu's position, he knew that the only possible move that he could have made at that moment was to run away. The others nodded in agreement upon hearing those words. With deep frowns on their foreheads, they seemed to be deep in thought to figure out a way to overcome the powerful World of Blizzard. But it did not take them long to shake their heads helplessly. They all came to the same conclusion in the end. Unless their cultivation was decisively above Zhong Qing's, there was nothing they could do. With such a thought in mind, they quickly turned their gazes toward the Saint 9 Dan young man, and saw the bewildered look on his face. It seemed as if the young man was at a complete loss as to what he could do as well. However, his body suddenly jolted as a thought surfaced in his mind, and with a nimble forward step, he entered into the midst of the other party's area of attack. Surprisingly, even though he had walked into Zhong Qing's field, none of the attacks seemed to land on him. With a simple wave of his hand, the snow seemed to be pulled along with him, swiftly congregating to form a massive snowball. Pung! Zhong Qing was knocked into the distance as crimson blood spurted furiously from his lips. He actually lost in a single move. The scholastic masters in the area widened their eyes in shock. They were all taken aback by what they had just seen. As experts of the great frontistry of Confucianism, they were more than capable of defeating multiple students simultaneously, even with their cultivation suppressed. But that young man had actually managed to defeat Zhong Qing that easily. They had witnessed the duel from the start to the end, and the moves that Fan Xiaoxu had executed looked ordinary on the surface. Yet, for some reason, as if they embodied a deeper ingenuity, those moves somehow managed to easily breach Zhong Qing's defenses, rendering him completely powerless. Even if they were in Zhong Qing's place, they did not think that they would have fared any better than him. To think that it was possible for one's combat techniques to reach such a level. Just who in the world was Fan Xiaoxu's teacher? While the scholastic masters were taken aback by what they had witnessed, Fan Xiaoxu was also staring at his palms with incredulous eyes. All he remembered was someone calling him away, while he was waiting at the foot of the mountain for the examination to start. Then everything had gone blank afterward. By the time he came to once more, he was already in the great frontistery of Confucianism. He felt that it was unreasonable for Zhong Qing to abruptly have made a move on an ordinary student just like that, and he had already been prepared to be completely destroyed. Yet, a memory had suddenly surfaced in his mind in this moment of distress. This memory contained some insights regarding combat techniques. He had simply moved in accordance to the principles stated by those combat techniques, and before he knew it, he had already defeated the seemingly unreachable Zhong Qing. Just as Fan Xiaoxu was trying to make sense of the ridiculous situation that was happening to him, a voice suddenly sounded in his mind. I am Zhang Xian. I borrowed your body for a moment to resolve some urgent matters. I have given you a memory fragment containing insights to combat techniques as compensation for my offense, and I hope that you will keep my identity a secret in return. He recognized the voice to be from the person who had knocked him out back then. Zhang Xian? If his memory could allow me to defeat even a scholastic master with ease, does this mean that he's an ancient sage? Fan Xiaoxu's heart jolted in alarm. To be able to leave a sliver of his memory in his heart without inflicting the slightest harm to him. This was something that only veteran ancient sages could pull off. Even the ancient sage of their lineage was unable to pull it off. He could hardly begin to imagine just how powerful this person known as Zhang Xian was. If that Zhang Xian person willed it, he would be able to destroy him with just a mere thought. But he had chosen not to do so. Not only so, the other party had even compensated him. From this, it could be deduced that this Zhang Xian person was not an evil person at heart. Since that was the case, regardless of why the other party wanted to come to the great frontistery of Confucianism, it should be fine for him to keep it a secret. Besides, matters concerning ancient sages could only be resolved by ancient sages themselves. As a Saint Nindan cultivator, no one would believe him, even if he really spoke about it. Thus, he quickly assimilated the piece of memory that the other party had left in his mind before turning to the scholastic masters before him with an excited grin on his face. Do any of you still want to test my cultivation? Make your move. If you feel insecure, I don't mind facing all of you at once. He had just tried out the battle technique earlier, and it had been proven to work. This would be a good opportunity for him to test the extent of his improvement. Seeing how arrogant a mere freshman was, Mi Xian and the others looked at one another for a moment before taking a step forward. 30 breaths later, they were all floored. Fan Xiaoxu stared at his trembling hands with reddened eyes, unable to believe the miracle that had just befallen him. His talent and strength could only have been said to be average among the youths of the 100 schools of philosophers. Under normal circumstances, it would have been difficult for him to clear the examination. Who could have known that he would catch the eye of an ancient sage and be imparted top-notch combat techniques that allowed him to overpower even the scholastic masters? This was an accomplishment that he would not have dared dream of in the past. If even a sliver of that ancient sage's combat techniques could raise his fighting prowess by such a degree, he shuddered to imagine just how powerful the ancient sage himself was. I wonder who this ancient sage Zhang Xian is. Fan Xiaoxu looked into the distant sky as a towering, heroic figure took form in his mind. There was no Zhang among the 100 schools of philosophers, so the other party was likely an outsider. Then again, there was no way that he could verify his identity, so there was no use thinking too deeply into it. All in all, the only thing that was important to him was that he had learned the combat techniques from ancient sage Zhang Xian and was now indebted to him. You shall be the one and only teacher I truly acknowledge from this day onward, and nothing will change that determination of mine. Fan Xiaoxu swore deep in his heart. Who? A figure was slowly walking leisurely through the great frontistery of Confucianism. There was a huge crowd around him, but not a single person seemed to notice his presence. The surrounding space had been distorted in a manner that prevented the slightest hint of light from falling upon him. This figure was none other than Zhang Xian. His goal was to enter the great frontistery of Confucianism without causing too huge a ruckus, and since he had achieved his goal, there was no longer any need for him to disguise himself. Thus, he had released Fan Xiaoxu not too long after arriving at the great frontistery of Confucianism. Of course, He did not forget to compensate Fan Xiaoxu fairly for the matter. Having inherited the full heritage of the soul oracles, he was able to pull off a task as difficult as transplanting a sliver of his memories without harming the other party with ease. As for how much Fan Xiaoxu would benefit from receiving a sliver of his memories, that would not be his problem to worry about anymore. He had already given the other party the opportunity, and whether Fan Xiaoxu himself was able to grasp it or not was up to him. That being said, while transplanting a sliver of his memories seemed to be the more efficient way to gain power, his foundation would not be as stable as Fan Xiaofeng and Fan Xiaoxing's, who had gained their insights through practical experience and self-discovery. In other words, even though Fan Xiaoxu's fighting prowess would likely be greater Fan Xiaofeng and Fan Xiaoxing for the time being, as time passed, it was likely that Fan Xiaofeng and Fan Xiaoxing would eventually surpass him. Of course, he would have likely left the Wuxia domain by then, after uncovering Kong Shi's secrets. Putting aside the miscellaneous thoughts in his mind, Zhang Xian continued ahead. He strolled around the city like great frontispiece of Confucianism for a moment, before finally setting his gaze upon a stately room. Sage Ancestral Hall. If Kong Shi has hidden any secrets in the great frontispiece of Confucianism, they will likely be here, Zhang Xian thought. What was standing before him was a unique building that was absent in the master-teacher pavilions of the master-teacher continent, the Sage Ancestral Hall. Placed within the Sage Ancestral Hall were a sculpture of Kong Shi himself and his individual possessions. It was a room used specifically for paying respects to him. Of the entire great frontispiece of Confucianism, this was the place that had the greatest relevance to Kong Shi. Thus, Zhang Xian took a deep breath before making his way over to the Sage Ancestral Hall. However, before he could reach his destination, a ray of light suddenly descended from the sky. It seemed like a formation had seen through the distortions of space that he had created around himself, and discovered his presence. Hung Long. Following which, a massive palm tore through space to slam down upon him. The surrounding space swiftly collapsed under the tremendous might, and it felt as if the entire Wuxia domain would burst as a result of the force. Zhang Xian did not think that he would be discovered even though he had hidden fairly well. He took a step back before pushing back against the palm with a powerful punch of his own. Even though he had not achieved a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, his fighting prowess was already on par with blood reincarnation realm experts. As Jinqi surged through his meridians, a devastating force was swiftly gathering at the tips of his knuckles. As the fist and palm collided with one another, Zhang Xian's body jolted a little. To his surprise, that palm strike was not any weaker than his fist. It also harnessed the might of a blood reincarnation realm expert. I mustn't drag things out. Zhang Xian's motive for going to the Wuxia domain was to uncover Kong Shi's trail, after capturing a deity from the azure. His goal had never been to cause trouble, and in order to avoid unnecessary complications, it would be best for him to end this battle as quickly as possible. Otherwise, once the ancient sages of the 100 schools of philosophers noticed his presence, things could really get troublesome. With a flick of his wrist, the Dragonbone Divine Spear materialized in Zhang Xian's grasp. Gathering the full might of his body, he drove it right toward the palm in the sky. Despite the incredible momentum of the spear, it left nothing more than a slight indentation in the surrounding space, almost reminiscent of a needle piercing into one's skin. The spear had retained all of the energy within it, to the extent that even the crowd not too far away would not imagine that two ancient sages were colliding with one another, just 10 meters away from them. Pung! With the powerful drive behind it, the Dragonbone Divine Spear overpowered the palm and pushed it back. As if recognizing that it was not a match for Zhang Xian, the palm also retreated back into the formation. Having overcome this obstacle, Zhang Xian swiftly made his way into the Sage Ancestral Hall. The first thing that came into his mind upon entering the stately room was the humongous Kong Shi sculpture, located at the center of the room. Standing in front of him was a warrior dressed in gold from top to bottom. This warrior was glaring at him with killing intent rippling in his eyes. There was a cut at the center of its palm, which indicated that it was the opponent who had made a move on Zhang Xian just a moment earlier. This is a golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy? Zhang Xian frowned in bewilderment. He had thought that the person who had attacked him earlier would be an expert from the great frontistery of Confucianism, protecting the sage ancestral hall. But it was only a warrior transformed from calligraphy. This was not the first time that he had encountered a golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy. He had come by them previously at ancient sage Ranxio's ancient domain. To think that it's possible for calligraphy to harness the might of an ancient sage 3-dan cultivator. Was this golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy left behind by Kong Shi himself? Zhang Xian wondered. There was no doubt that Kong Shi was the strongest person who had ever walked on the master-teacher continent, but he had not thought that the other party had actually been that powerful. Even a single calligraph character from him wielded strength that was comparable to the current him. If Kong Shi wrote down a bunch of words, there would practically be nothing in this world that could stop him anymore. But an instant after this thought formulated in Zhang Xian's mind, he swiftly shook his head and denied that notion. It was easier said than done to produce a golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy. Not only was it extremely testing on the skills and state of mind of the painter, it was also highly demanding on one's jinqi and blood essence for nourishment. Given Zhang Xian's current capabilities, he would only be able to create golden warriors of Mentor's calligraphy at the level of sempiternal realm cultivators, and his limit was 3 of them. Anything more than that would be pushing it too far. But no matter how powerful it is nothing more than a character, Zhang Xian muttered beneath his breath. He released his spiritual perception to swiftly scan the surroundings, and he heaved a sigh of relief after seeing that the earlier battle had not caught anyone's attention. Turning his gaze back to the golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy, he pushed his right leg against the ground and dashed forward, piercing his spear in the direction of the golden warrior. Through concentrating his jinqi at the tip of the spear, a swiftly revolving sphere of energy swiftly formed in front of him. His spearmanship was in harmony with the world. Simple was its form, but versatility was its core. The unpredictable trajectory of his spear made it extremely difficult to defend against it. In order to end this battle as quickly as possible, Zhang Xian chose not to hold back at all. Gathering all of the strength at his disposal, he exerted a might that was almost comparable to a dimension-shatter realm cultivator. In less than 2 breaths, the golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy was shattered, reduced to an ink character on the wall behind the sculpture. Confucianism. Seeing that the character had not made any move after the earlier offense, Zhang Xian walked up to the sculpture of Kong Shi and bowed deeply as a show of respect before looking around the area. It was likely that the golden warrior of Mentor's calligraphy from earlier was a trial that those who wanted to enter the sage ancestral hall would have to go through, similar to what had happened in ancient sage Ranxio's ancient domain. Only those who had defeated it would be qualified to explore the premises. The room was mainly empty except for the sculpture at the center. Thus, Zhang Xian walked up to the side door and saw a corridor beyond it. The corridor was wide and spacious, and there were numerous tablets floating alongside it. This is Kong Shi's entire life story? Zhang Xian's eyes lit up in excitement. The floating tablets were inscribed with the records of Kong Shi's life, detailing everything that had happened since his birth. Laying his eyes on one of the floating tablets, Zhang Xian felt as if his soul had traveled through space-time to witness the grand life that Kong Shi had lived. Unlike the usual depictions of his life, Kong Shi was not a connate saint. No matter how one looked at it, he was an ordinary individual. The only thing that was noteworthy was his deep interest in books and sharp wits. But a day suddenly came when he deviated from his ordinary life. It was as if an epiphany had suddenly struck him, causing his cultivation to surge. Within the short span of a year, he achieved a breakthrough beyond Fighter 9-dan, Transcendent Mortal 9-dan, and even Saint 9-dan. In terms of progress, Kong Shi was no slower than him. It was still the era where the otherworldly demonic tribe ruled over the master-teacher continent back then, and the humans lived under oppression. Along his growth, Kong Shi's footsteps never halted. He fought country after country, salvaging mankind from the claws of the otherworldly demonic tribe. At the same time, he spread his teachings and ideals while taking in students. Before long, the Master Teacher Pavilion, that they knew today was established. Feeling threatened by Kong Shi's presence, the otherworldly demonic tribe launched an ambush on Kong Shi and his disciples, trapping them in Shanghai for many months. Many thought that Kong Shi was done for. But in that crucial period, he created the Great Codex of Spring and Autumn, and successfully achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage that freed him from the danger that he was in, and he even successfully assassinated Vicious. Soon enough, the otherworldly demonic tribe was driven back and sealed within the otherworldly battlefield, thus liberating mankind once and for all. From the looks of it, it seems like Kong Shi's breakthrough to ancient sage wasn't just an ordinary comprehension of temporal laws. Zhang Xian pondered as he followed Kong Shi's journey through his life. The Great Codex of Spring and Autumn contained the secrets of time. Zhang Xian himself had been to the Temple of Confucius, and the flow of time in that folded space was indeed different from that of the world outside. Ancient sage Ranqiu's breakthrough was built upon his spearmanship, and ancient sage Qiu Wu's breakthrough came from his deep comprehension of spatial laws. All along, he had thought that what Kong Shi had grasped in his breakthrough to ancient sage were the temporal laws, but it seemed like there was more to it. The founder of the Zhang clan was a person who had comprehended the time quintessence and successfully achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage based on it. There was no doubt that he was a powerful individual, but he still came nowhere close in comparison to the world's teacher. Harboring doubts in his heart, Zhang Xian moved on to the other stone tablets. After being driven away to the otherworldly battlefield, the otherworldly demonic tribe was indignant and craved vengeance. Thus, they summoned a deity in hopes of turning the tables, but the deity was instead captured by Kong Shi. Watching up to this point, Zhang Xian's breathing hastened a little. His goal here was to uncover the encounter that Kong Shi had with the captured deity, and the answer was right before him. Kong Shi took the deity away from the Master-Teacher Pavilion headquarters, the safest place on the Master-Teacher continent, and brought him to a rather remote location. This remote location was a barren land, and the spiritual energy was thin. There were no decent buildings or cities to be seen. There was a sudden jump in the story. It was hard to tell whether the deity had been killed or something, but he vanished without a trace. At the same time, Kong Shi seemed to have sustained some injuries, so he chose to stop by the area temporarily to recuperate. On the very last tablet, it was detailed that Kong Shi entered a mini-world. If his deduction was correct, this mini-world referred to the Wuxia domain where the 100 schools of philosophers resided. Wuxia domain? Could it be that? Zhang Xian took a closer look at the remote location where Kong Shi had taken the deity to, and his eyebrows suddenly started twitching. He actually recognized this remote location. It was none other than the current Tianxian kingdom. Could it be that the Wuxia domain wasn't created by Kong Shi? Zhang Xian pondered. He had known prior to coming here that the 100 schools of philosophers had departed from the Master-Teacher continent to reside in a mini-world that Kong Shi had created. This was also why he had not been surprised when he saw the Wuxia domain after breaking the seal. However, the stone tablet right before him was telling him that this was not the case. This mini-world seemed to have existed since time immemorial. It was not one of Kong Shi's creations. The records of Kong Shi also stopped here. Could it be that the Wuxia domain had some links with the Azure? With a deep frown, Zhang Xian proceeded ahead. Beyond the corridor of floating stone tablets was a majestic hall, with walls filled with murals. Those murals depicted the contributions made by the generations of experts from the 100 schools of philosophers after entering this mini-world. Just as he had guessed, the greensprout wheat had indeed been nurtured by an ancient sage, but it was not by ancient sage Ziqi, as he had previously guessed. Instead, it had been completed by one of his descendants. It had taken tens of thousands of years of careful modifications before it was refined into a miraculous crop, allowing even non-cultivators to reach the level of Zhongshe realm upon maturity. Of course, its effects did not stop just there. Through the enhancements of their constitution, it also allowed cultivators to advance through the ranks faster than usual. Browsing through the murals, Zhang Xian felt even more confused. There were no more records regarding Kong Shi from that point onward. It was as if Kong Shi had completely disappeared from the world, such that there was no more news regarding him. He walked to the very end and circled the area once more, but there was nothing to be seen. He could not help but sigh helplessly. It seemed like he had reached a bottleneck in his investigations. Shaking his head, he was just about to leave the sage ancestral hall to investigate the other locations of the great frontistery of Confucianism when he suddenly noticed something and flitted to a corner of the room. At the same time, he swiftly set up over a dozen seals on him, causing all traces of his presence to fade into obscurity. Voila! Barely a second after he had hidden himself, the sound of footsteps echoed in the air. Several people were making their way into the sage ancestral hall. Zhang Xian secretly peered over from his hiding spot. The person standing at the forefront of the group was surprisingly a familiar face. Ancient Sage Yanqing. The group that was following behind him also struck a chord in his memories. They had participated in the encirclement of Sovereign Chen Yongbak at the Temple of Confucius. With his current strength and grasp of spatial laws, as long as he did not intentionally release his aura or communicate with anyone, he was able to completely conceal his presence even from ancient sages. They don't seem to be doing too well. When Zhang Xian first met them back at the Temple of Confucius, they had emanated the inviolable airs of an ancient sage, commanding an aura that forced others to bow to their authority. However, at this very moment, they felt like a great tree that was swiftly withering away. Be it their appearance or the aura that they were emanating, it felt as if strength and vitality were swiftly seeping away from them. This was something that he had felt from Zhang Hongtian back then when his lifespan reached its limits. I wonder what's wrong. Zhang Xian looked on contemplatively. It was true that the battle against Sovereign Chen Yong was intense, and many of them had sustained significant injuries throughout the course of the battle. However, their conditions were nowhere as severe as Zhang Hongtian's, and they should have been able to recover to their peak with sufficient time. Given so, how did they land themselves in their current state within a short few months? This was especially so for ancient sage Yanqing. His face reflected infirmity, the vigorous spirit in his eyes had dimmed out, and his movements were slightly stiff. It was almost as if he was about to meet his end. Cough cough. Just as Zhang Xian was trying to figure out what was going on, coughs echoed in the air, and fresh blood seeped from the corners of ancient sage Yanqing's lips. Yanqing, an ancient sage behind him, looked over worriedly. I can still hold on. Ancient sage Yanqing raised his hand and replied feebly. Gathering the last bit of his strength left, he turned around and said, Let's begin after paying our respects. Are you certain that you want to do this? There's no other choice. This is the mission entrusted to the 100 schools of philosophers. We can't shirk from our responsibility. Ancient sage Yanqing replied with an unreadable look on his face. Shaking his head, he walked up to Kong Shi's sculpture and kneeled down. The other ancient sages quickly followed suit. To the venerated world's teacher, I am the 73rd generation of offspring of ancient sage Ziyuan, Yanqing. I have heeded your teachings and held steadfast in my duties over the years. There has not been a day since when I have slacked. With the appearance of the Temple of Confucius, I know that we are reaching the breaking point that our predecessors warned us about, and it's time for us to do our part for the world. We are willing to offer our lives to the world. So if you are able to hear our prayers from above, I implore you to look after our clans after we are gone. The words spoken by ancient sage Yanqing was solemn, as if he was prepared to meet his end. Kong Shi's sculpture simply stood silently on the spot, leaving a deafening silence in the air. After praying, the group got to their feet. Somehow, ancient sage Yanqing looked a little feebler than before as he said, Let's go. Helplessness was reflected in the eyes of those high and mighty ancient sages, but they chose not to say a word at all as they followed quietly behind ancient sage Yanqing. Breaking point? Offer their lives? Shortly after the ancient sages of the 100 schools of philosophers took their leave, Zhang Xian removed the seals around him as he lowered his head contemplatively. Under normal circumstances, those ancient sages should have returned to hibernation. So why did they suddenly pay a visit to this sage ancestral hall and speak such words? Furthermore, what was with the injuries inflicted on their bodies? The last thing he heard about them was that they were busy repairing the Temple of Confucius. Were there some dangers involved in the repairs of the Temple of Confucius? Harboring deep bewilderment in his heart, Zhang Xian quickly followed them out. Dragonbone Divine Spear. I need you to conceal my aura for me. The Dragonbone Divine Spear swiftly warped into a belt, which wrapped itself around Zhang Xian's body. In the blink of an eye, it looked as if Zhang Xian had contracted a fair bit. Not even the slightest hint of aura could be felt from him, such that even blood reincarnation realm experts would be unable to sense his presence. Even though Zhang Xian's current fighting prowess was comparable to blood reincarnation realm experts, he still had not taken the last step to achieving a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. As such, his control over his powers was a little lacking. Without layers and layers of barriers, he was not confident in keeping his aura sufficiently under wraps to track the most powerful experts on the Master-Teacher continent without alarming them. On the other hand, the Dragonbone Divine Spear had devoured the dragon blood and was only a step away from achieving a full breakthrough to the Dimension Shatterer realm. In terms of prowess, it was even stronger than Ancient Sage Yanqing. With its help, it was unlikely that those ancient sages would be able to notice him. After leaving the Sage Ancestral Hall, Zhang Xian saw Ancient Sage Yanqing leaping into the sky and tearing open space to travel somewhere else. Zhang Xian quickly followed behind them. Some time later, they arrived at an elevated platform amid a remote mountain range. The sky above was completely empty. There were no clouds, nor even any hint of blueness to be seen. It was an empty void. The flow of space in here is extremely fast, Zhang Xian noted. To the untrained eye, this place seemed to be extremely peaceful. However, as someone who had grasped the spatial quintessence, he could sense that this space was flowing extremely quickly, resulting in massive changes every passing second. It felt as if the entire area would collapse soon under the strain. That was not all. Beyond the void, there was a blood-curdling sensation that seemed to phase one's soul directly. Let's begin, Ancient Sage Yanqing urged after getting into position. Nodding in agreement, the group of ancient sages began to drive their Jinqi. However, they were disrupted by a sudden gale. Two silhouettes were swiftly making their way over. Noting the presence of the two uninvited guests, the ancient sages quickly halted their actions and turned to look. Naturally, Zhang Xian did the same. Who? The two guests landed on the ground. The first person was a young lady that appeared to be in her early 20s. She had a slender figure and pitch-black hair that extended down to his waist, and she gave out a delicate impression. Her eyes carried deep anxiety that reflected her trepidation toward what was about to come. There was a green-robed young man in his early 20s, as well standing behind her. Zhang Xian happened to know him. He was one of the offspring of the 100 schools of philosophers who had fought with him over the prime amulet back in Ancient Sage Ranchio's ancient domain. Yan Shui, what are you two doing here? Ancient Sage Yangqing asked with a livid look on his face upon seeing the two of them. The young lady took a step forward and said with conviction, as a descendant of Kong Shi, how can I possibly remain uninvolved when such a matter has happened? A descendant of Kong Shi? Zhang Xian widened his eyes. Is she Kong Shiyao? He had heard far too many people raising the name Kong Shiyao before him. She was rumored to be the strongest expert of the 100 schools of philosophers, possessing superior talents in cultivation. It was said that she did not pale in comparison to him. There was a time when he had thought that Luo Ruoxin's true identity was Kong Shiyao, but his deductions had fallen through. Seeing the person whom he had heard so much about in the flesh, he could not help but take a closer look to assess her closely. It had to be said that the rumors were not completely unfounded. Not only was she blessed with impeccable looks, she also emanated an ethereal aura reminiscent of a deity. It was hard to pull one's gaze away from her. Luo Ruoxin carried a lofty aura that pushed others away from her, making her hard to approach. On the other hand, Kong Shiyao carried an aura that induced others to trust and submit to her, the aura of a natural leader. Many would willingly lay down their lives for her under her command. Formidable master teachers are able to draw the gazes of others with just their presence. This is the first time I have seen someone who is able to bring this quality out to such an extent. It seems like Kong Shiyao has truly inherited Kong Shi's bloodline, Zhang Xian thought. Kong Shi's lineage was truly extraordinary. In terms of cultivation, Kong Shiyao was at sempiternal realm consummation as well, the same as him. She had not achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage yet, but the aura in her body felt condensed and heavy. Most likely, her fighting prowess exceeded that of ordinary ancient sages. This was really the first time that Zhang Xian had seen someone whose talents were at a level similar to his. Since you are aware that you are a descendant of Kong Shi, you should also know of the responsibilities that you have to shoulder. We can afford to lose our lives, but you have to remain alive regardless of what it takes. The descendants of Kong Shi don't fear death. Kong Shiyao replied in determination. I carry the purest bloodline of Kong Shi within me, so I'm the best candidate to stabilize the space here. There's no point arguing about this matter. Seeing that Kong Shiyao's mind was set, ancient sage Yanqing was silent for a moment before sighing deeply. Shiyao, you are still young, and there's a long way ahead of you. I am just a pile of old bones, who is going to reach the limits of his lifespan soon. There's no need for you to give up your life for this. This matter isn't open for negotiation. As he spoke, he suddenly waved his hand. A sudden outburst of energy shrouded Kong Shiyao and sealed her on the spot, rendering her unable to move. Ancient Sage Yanqing. Not expecting Ancient Sage Yanqing to make such a move, Kong Shiyao exclaimed in a fluster. A mixture of panic and anxiety welling up in her caused tears to brim in her eyes. But unmoved by Kong Shiyao's expression, Ancient Sage Yanqing turned to Yin Shui and sternly commanded, take care of her well. Even at the expense of your life, you can't allow any harm to fall upon her. Yes, Yin Shui replied resolutely. Ancient Sage Yanqing closed his eyes for a short moment, before looking at the other ancient sages and nodding. Let's begin. As he spoke, a decisive and powerful aura gushed forth from his body. With the other ancient sages around cooperating with him, they swiftly formed a massive pillar of light that surged right into the void. The rumbling of thunder echoed from the void in space, and innumerable powerful surges of energy clawed at the rift, seemingly intending to climb their way out to unleash their horrors upon this world. Is this the Jinqi of slaughter of the otherworldly demonic tribe? Feeling this aura, Zhang Xian was taken aback for a little. He pondered deeply for a moment before shaking his head. No, that's not it. It feels even heavier than the Jinqi of slaughter, almost like mercury. My meridians wouldn't be able to take the burden if I absorbed it. Zhang Xian's face turned even more grim at the realization. The energy beyond the rift was similar to the Jinqi of slaughter, but it took on an even more bizarre form. Even with his current strength, he dared not to absorb it into his body recklessly. Normal spiritual energy was lighter than water, so the meridians were still able to withstand its flow without falling apart. However, the same could not be said about the mercury-like energy above him. While it was also fluid, the chances were that its weight would crush his meridians and destroy his body from within if he dared absorb it. This very energy was raging behind the rift, threatening to pour forth upon the world at any moment. If it poured out of the rift, all of the cultivators of the 100 schools of philosophers could very well explode on the spot once they came into contact with the energy. What's going on here? Zhang Xian was horrified. It was as if he was being exposed to a completely different side of the world that he had never seen before. If the seal failed to ward off the energy, it could possibly spell the end of the Kungsi domain. Stand your ground and fend it off. While Zhang Xian was still trying to make sense of what was going on, ancient sage Yanqing slowly rose into the air. His hair flew around messily under the furious tug of the air currents. He was serving as the very center of the formation created by the group of ancient sages, and he was responsible for channeling their energy toward the void. Thunder growled forbiddingly in the air as the pressure from the void grew heavier and heavier. It was almost as if the sky was going to fall upon them. At the same time, the faces of the ancient sages turned more and more severe as their black hair swiftly turned white. They are putting their life force on the line to seal the rift. It was no wonder they had aged so much within less than 3 months. It turned out that they had been expending their life force in order to maintain the seal before them. The lightning in the air grew more and more concentrated, as if signifying the rage of the heavens. Ancient sage Yanqing bit his finger and flicked his fresh blood toward the depths of the void. Following which, a humongous coffin vaguely emerged from the void. The appearance of the coffin caused the rift to shrink a little, and the mercury-like power that was going to descend upon the world also cowered fearfully in its face. At the same time, the pressure crushing down on the crowd lessened significantly. That coffin, Zhang Xian thought with a frown. It was already bewildering for there to be a coffin hidden in the midst of the void. But what was even more shocking to Zhang Xian was the design of the coffin. To his astonishment, it was identical to the one that he had encountered prior to entering the Wuxia domain, the one that ancient sage Ranqiu's corpse was stored in. That coffin seems to be serving as the crux of the seal, Zhang Xian swiftly analyzed. This coffin was not made for the sole purpose of containing a corpse. Rather, it seemed to be a powerful artifact that was used to sustain the formation, sealing away the rifts in the air. It was due to the power of the coffin that the mercury-like power was unable to descend from the heavens and wreak havoc. Most likely, there's an ancient sage whose strength is on par with ancient sage Ranqiu within the coffin, Zhang Xian deduced. The fact that the formation was able to prevent the mercury-like energy from descending evidenced its incredible prowess. Serving as the crux of the formation, there was no way the person within the coffin could be ordinary. The seal at the entrance of Wuxia domain used ancient sage Ranqiu's body as its crux, and even the dimension Shatter Realm Vicious had been unable to break it open. Considering how this formation was even more powerful, it was hard to imagine how powerful the person had been back in his prime. Jia, the coffin in the sky jolted intensely, and several slight cracks appeared by its sides. Open, along with the appearance of the cracks, veins popped out on ancient sage Yanqing's temples. He swiftly sent a fresh stream of his blood toward the cracks of the coffin in order to further drive its opening. However, due to the severe loss of blood, his face was turning as pale as a sheet of paper. His body trembled uncontrollably from his overexertion, and his skin quickly lost its suppleness, turning loose and wrinkly. It was only an instant, but he looked as if he had aged another 10 years. Boom! He had never seen ancient sage Ziyuan's sculpture before, but that did not mean that he knew nothing about this renowned ancient sage at all. Ancient sage Ziyuan was renowned for being Kong Shi's first direct disciple. While his fighting prowess was beneath that of ancient sage Ranqiu, his reputation and prestige far exceeded that of the rest of the 72 sages. Putting aside his honorable character and exceptional proficiency in many different fields, he was also the person who had helped Kong Shi compile the heritages of numerous occupations and standardize the ranking system. In contrast to the sharp aura that ancient sage Ranqiu commanded, the corpse before him seemed to emanate an aura more like the all-encompassing ocean that accepted the currents from hundreds of tributaries and assimilated them. It was through tapping into this superior strength that the mercury-like energy had not been able to breach the formation to seep into the master-teacher continent thus far. Most likely, ancient sage Ziyuan was the only one among the 72 sages who was capable of this feat. Besides, the fact that ancient sage Yanqing's blood was required to activate the coffin and nourish the corpse made it very apparent who was within it. First ancient sage Ranqiu's corpse, and now ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse, Zhang Xian thought as he trembled a little. These two ancient sages were figures whose names still resounded across the master-teacher continent, even after so many years. He had thought that they would have left the master-teacher continent together with Kong Shi. But who could have known that he would find their corpses there? Tribute! Ancient sage Yanqing bellowed deafeningly as his body began to break apart like a smashed ceramic vase. Blood spurted out from his veins and arteries before surging toward the corpse in a steady current. Taking in the blood, the stiffness in the corpse seemed to lessen, making it seem as though it would come to life at any moment. At the same time, the formation also strengthened significantly. The rifts that had been on the verge of bursting open earlier swiftly stabilized and mended themselves. Ancient sage Yanqing originates from ancient sage Ziyuan's lineage, so the latter's blood flows through his veins. He's trying to use his blood to augment and sustain ancient sage Ziyuan's strength, so as to strengthen the formation, sealing away the rifts. Zhang Xian finally understood what was going on. It was no wonder ancient sage Yin Qing had spoken of sacrificing himself earlier. The formation had come from his predecessor, and the blood of those from his lineage would be more effective in stabilizing the formation once more. Of course, considering that Kong Shiyao possessed Kong Shi's bloodline, her blood would likely have an exceptional effect on ancient sage Zi Yuan's corpse, perhaps even exceeding that of ancient sage Yin Qing. However, considering how valued Kong Shiyao was among the 100 schools of philosophers, there was no way ancient sage Yin Qing would allow her to sacrifice herself. It seems like everything is settling down. Under the influx of blood, the seal swiftly stabilized, and the pressure from the void gradually vanished. Ancient sage Yin Qing heaved a sigh of relief. The current him had expended most of his blood. He had already struck his limit. It was only a matter of time before the last bit of vitality in his body dried up, and he would come crashing back down to the ground as a lifeless corpse. Realizing this reality, Kong Shiyao pounded desperately on the seal that had trapped her with tears in her eyes. However, with her strength, she was completely powerless to change anything. At the same time, Yin Shui turned his head away and averted his gaze, not wanting to see the downfall of the man whom he had respected his entire life. Hong Long Long. It was at this moment that things started going awry. As the formation grew stronger and stronger under the influx of ancient sage Yin Qing's blood, it looked as if the sealing would be completed very soon. However, at that crucial moment, a massive hand suddenly pushed its way through the mending rift. This sight was similar to the descent of the deity, which he had witnessed previously during the fight against Sovereign Chen Ling Hu. The hand flicked its wrist lightly, and ancient sage Yin Qing was suddenly slammed into the ground, halting the transfusion of blood. Pooh, pooh, pooh. At the same time, the ancient sages who were supplying ancient sage Yin Qing with their strength spurted blood under the backlash and collapsed to the ground as well. A Dimension Shatter Realm expert, Zhang Xian's face darkened. The owner of this hand was clearly stronger than the deity, whom he had killed with his golden page back then. Even without an altar on their side to establish a connection, he was able to breach the dimension barrier and tear open a passageway with brute force. Could it be that the void was the passageway to the azure that he had been looking for all along? With such doubts in his mind, the hand in the sky began thrashing around, causing the reinforced formation to weaken, such that it was beginning to falter. We need to stop him. Caught off guard by the abrupt turn of events, ancient sage Yin Qing roared anxiously as he swiftly kicked off into the air. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled a saber in his hand down upon the thrashing hand. He knew that if he wanted to sustain the formation, it would be of paramount importance to sever the hand, or else anything they did would be swiftly unraveled by it. Humph. Sensing ancient sage Yin Qing's aggression, the owner of the hand opened up his palm and pinched his fingers together lightly. The saber from ancient sage Yin Qing was caught precisely in between his fingers. As if a pair of unyielding pincers, no matter how ancient sage Yin Qing tugged, he was unable to retrieve his saber. We need to move together. Knowing the severity of the matter, the other ancient sages quickly flitted forth. With their combined might, many rifts swiftly formed around the already unstable space in the area. Several bundles of black flames descended from the void, raising an inferno around the area. Yin Shui, release me. Otherwise, all of us will die here. Kong Shiyao yelled out desperately at the young man beside her. Yin Shui's face warped in hesitation as he struggled with the conflict in his mind. What are you hesitating over? Hesitate any longer, and our tens of thousands of years of heritage will be destroyed. Kong Shiyao roared wrathfully upon seeing that Yin Shui was still hesitating. All right. Knowing how dangerous the situation was, Yin Shui quickly tapped his finger on the seal trapping Kong Shiyao and released it. While Yin Shui's cultivation was only at sempiternal realm consummation, he shared the same power origin as ancient sage Yin Qing, so it was much easier to unravel it. It did not take long for the seal around Kong Shiyao to dissipate entirely. Humph! With a ferocious cry, Kong Shiyao's eyebrows shot up as incredible energy swiftly built up within her. With a leap, She rose into the sky and whipped out a sword. Pointing the sword toward the hand, she brandished it with lightning speed. Remarkable. Zhang Xian nodded as he took this scene into sight. Just as he had thought, Kang Shiyao's fighting prowess was formidable despite her young age. Just like him, her strength had also reached the blood reincarnation realm. The sword that she wielded in her hand was extremely powerful too. It was stronger than the Dragonbone Divine Spear. And in Kang Shiyao's grasp, it brought forth a might comparable to blood reincarnation realm consummation cultivators. Ding ding ding! Despite that, her sword chi only caused numerous sparks to rub off the hand. Nevertheless, she still continued to slash her sword relentlessly at the hand. Persistent cockroach. Seeing that a small fry from a lower dimension actually dared make a move against him, the owner of the hand bellowed angrily as he flicked his finger. Pung! Kang Shiya was knocked back by an incredible force, causing her back to crash heavily against the ground. Blood seeped down from the corners of her lips. There was simply too huge a gap between the blood reincarnation realm and the dimension shatter realm. Back then, even when Zhang Xian coordinated with multiple blood reincarnation realm ancient sages, he had been no match for the deity summoned by sovereign Chunling Sila. After flicking Kang Shiya back, the hand proceeded to flick its finger, creating a shockwave that kept ancient sage Yin Qing and the others at bay. With a piercing cry, the rift in the unstable space widened as yet another hand passed through it, following which a head came through as well. Just like the deity from before, this person was planning to make a forceful descent onto the master-teacher continent. Boom! Along with the emergence of the head, the mercury-like power began to seep through the rift and diffuse into the surroundings. In response, Zhang Xian hurriedly sealed his acupoints, not daring to absorb any of it at all. Similar to the Jinqi of slaughter, this mercury-like energy was a special type of energy that could potentially crush one's meridians, causing one's cultivation to fall sharply, or even put one in severe danger. We need to kill him right now. Seeing that the deity had managed to push his head through the rift, the complexions of ancient sage Yin Qing and the others darkened. With a furious roar, they swiftly charged toward the figure climbing out from the void. All kinds of energy sweeping around the area caused the formation to shake non-stop. Piece after piece of space crumbled to the ground. With just a flick of his finger, the deity fended off everyone's attack. At the same time, he used his other hand to push himself out from the rift, and it did not take long for his entire shoulder to come into appearance. It was as if he was dealing with mere ants. Despite having to fend off the simultaneous assault of numerous ancient sages, he had strength spare to push himself through the dimension barrier. From that alone, it was certain that the deity was much stronger than that fellow whom he had killed with the golden page. We won't be able to stop him at this rate. Kang Shiya spat through gritted teeth. She had already launched several hundred slashes, such that her Jinqi was on the verge of drying up, but she was unable to inflict any damage at all. Grinding her teeth, she turned to ancient sage Yin Qing and said in a resounding voice, "Don't waste your strength on attacking anymore. Use your strength to pull ancient sage Zi Yuan's body here instead." This, as if having figured out what Kang Shiya was going to do, ancient sage Yin Qing shook his head instinctively. Ancient sage Yin Qing, there's no other way around it. If we waste any more time, we'll all lose our lives here. Kang Shiya berated. If that fellow climbed through the dimension barrier and descended to their world, they would all be slaughtered. At the same time, the 100 schools of philosophers would face a calamity of unprecedented proportions, and it would not be long before the devastation spread to the master-teacher continent. If they wished to overcome the current crisis, they needed the resolve to put their lives on the line. But you are the only one among Kang Shi's offspring to have a bloodline purity of over 8. You are the future of our 100 schools of philosophers, ancient sage Yin Qing said anxiously. If Kang Shiya did what she was thinking of, there was a good chance that she would lose her life. He was already old, so his death was inconsequential to the 100 schools of philosophers. However, the young lady was the descendant who had inherited the purest bloodline of Kang Shi in the past millennium. Furthermore, she had overcome 3 ancient sage ordeals to date. As long as she was given sufficient time, there was a good chance that she would become the first cultivator to reach the Dimension Shatter realm since Kong Shi's era. If he allowed her to die, he would not be able to face his predecessors even after his death. If that fellow succeeds, all of us will lose our lives here. What use will the purity of my bloodline be after all of us are dead? Kong Shiyao exclaimed. She took a deep breath before spurting out a mouthful of blood. Boom! As soon as she spat out the mouthful of blood, it immediately burst into flames in the air. In an instant, it seemed as if the surrounding time had been halted. Even the deity who was climbing out from the rift came to a halt. It was as if someone had struck the stop button. After spurting out the mouthful of blood, Kong Shiyao's face grew significantly paler. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead as she looked at the coffin floating not too far away and commanded, "Come here." Wang. Hearing the order, the coffin slowly made its way over to Kong Shiyao amid a light rumbling sound. This is impartation of heaven's will? Zhang Xian was surprised. This was the ability that Kong Shiyao had activated through her bloodline. All along, he had been wondering what the bloodline ability of those of Kong Shi's lineage was. But who would have thought that it was impartation of heaven's will? Was this not a little too simple? Compared to the Zhang clan's time acceleration and the Luo clan's spatial seal, was impartation of heaven's will not a little too lackluster in comparison? This did not seem to match up to Kong Shi's incredible strength. This isn't right. Zhang Xian frowned as he activated his Eye of Insight to take a closer look. What he saw made his heart jolt in astonishment. This isn't impartation of heaven's will, but impartation of heaven's will required one to impart knowledge that was acknowledged by the heavens in order to induce cultivators to heed their commands. While the heart of teacher comprehended by Zhang Xian allowed him to command plants and artifacts too, these beings needed to possess spirit or be enchanted with one. To put it in other words, impartation of heavens will only worked on those who possess spirit and were able to cultivate, and it required one to lecture on a cultivation technique that was suited for that individual's cultivation. It was easier said than done. For example, if Zhang Xian wanted to influence someone through impartation of heaven's will, his soul depth would have to exceed the other parties, and the content of his lecture needed to spark inspiration in the other party. As formidable as Kong Shiyao seemed, her true cultivation was only at sempiternal realm consummation. Even if her soul depth had reached the level of an ancient sage, it still should not have been possible for her to make a lifeless coffin and corpse to heed her orders. This is word of law. Zhang Xian widened his eyes in astonishment. Word of law was an ability that turned one's diction into laws of the world, compelling the elements of the world to obey one's command. On the surface, it might seem similar to impartation of heaven's will, but it was much more terrifying than that. Before the word of law, all temporal laws and spatial laws meant nothing at all. Even if he activated the Zhang clan's bloodline, all the young lady had to do was to utter the word stop, and his movements would come to a complete halt. This was not a manipulation of time or space, but the very elements of the world. The act of stopping would become a new law of the world, forcing one to abide by it. This was how terrifying the ability was. To think that this was the ability that Kong Shi had comprehended during his breakthrough to ancient sage. It was no wonder he had boasted such incredible strength. Hong Long. Meanwhile, Kong Shiyao flew over to the coffin and opened it. Ancient sage Zi Yuan's corpse swiftly flew out and floated in the air. Even though his eyes were tightly shut, the pulsations of energy that were coming from him made it seem as though he was alive. Pooh! After doing all of this, Kong Shiyao spurted another mouthful of blood as her face turned even paler. Her body shuddered a little as it seemed to reach its limits. As powerful as the word of law was, her cultivation was still too low. Forcefully activating ancient sage Zi Yuan's body had caused too heavy a toll on her, damaging her foundations. Sighing deeply, ancient sage Yanqing commanded, "Allow me." Boom! An incredible amount of blood gushed out from his body to surge into ancient sage Zi Yuan's corpse. This caused the aura that ancient sage Zi Yuan's corpse was emanating to swiftly grow stronger. Do you think that you can defeat me with a mere corpse? I really should snap you out of your daydreams. The deity sneered coldly as he thrust his palm downward. At that moment, his chest had also been pushed out through the dimension barrier as well. It seemed like it would not be long before he completely descended upon this world. The palm strike caused the surrounding space to swiftly compress together, forming something reminiscent of a black hole. Get him! With a ferocious cry, the remaining ancient sages rushed forward to meet the deity's palm. Hula! The incredible pressure sent shockwaves rippling into the surroundings. Before the ancient sages could react, their flesh had already been vaporized clean, leaving behind mere skeletons. Even so, they did not back down. They stood firmly in the air to stop the palm from landing on ancient sage Yin Qing and the others. Pung pung pung. The ancient sages plopped heavily onto the ground, forming numerous craters on the elevated platform. Given their current cultivation, they would not die instantly even after they were reduced to bones. However, they had hibernated for far too long, and they had not fully recovered from the wounds that they had sustained during the encirclement of Sovereign Chunyong. If they did not receive sufficient aeon of ancient sage to replenish their vitality, their lifespan would swiftly dwindle, and they would die without doubt. In other words, they were really putting their lives on the line to stand against the deity. I can't allow those from the 100 schools of philosophers to die here. Zhang Xian had not made a move thus far, because his multiple unpleasant encounters with the 100 schools of philosophers in the past, and he had thought that they would be able to handle the situation by themselves. He had worried that his sudden intervention would only worsen the situation, as the other ancient sages were bound to be wary of him. However, things were swiftly moving in the worst direction possible. He could not simply watch and leave those ancient sages of the 100 schools of philosophers to die. While he found their actions questionable, there was no doubt that they were protecting mankind in their own way, and they had made huge sacrifices for it. He could not simply watch as they lost their lives. Driving his energy, as he was just about to charge forth silently to inflict a fatal blow on the deity, Kong Shiyao suddenly spurted another mouthful of blood before commanding, "Stabilize and push him back." Wang. Following her words, the rifts in the sky began to heal simultaneously as the space swiftly stabilized. At the same time, the deity whose waist was already out of the dimension barrier suddenly retreated hurriedly under the command, moving back to his shoulder. It was only unfortunate that her cultivation was simply too low compared to the deity's. Even after using her bloodline ability, she was still unable to push the deity back to the azure once and for all. It's indeed his bloodline. Wonderful. This is truly superb. With this, the clan head will surely accept me as his direct disciple and grant me endless resources. Even though he was nearly expelled from the world, the deity did not show the slightest hint of fear toward Kong Shiyao's technique. Instead, his eyes glowed with frenzied excitement. At that moment, the corpse of ancient sage Ziyuan also seemed to have absorbed sufficient blood and slowly rose out of the coffin. With clenched fists, he sent a punch right toward the deity climbing out from the rift. Boom! This fist was completely devoid of any elegance or flamboyance, but the might it carried was astonishing, reaching the level of a Dimension Shatterer realm cultivator. Heh! In face of this devastating might, the deity did not show any trepidation. Instead, with a cold sneer, he placed his hands together. Selah! The formation sustained by ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse was forcefully ripped apart, causing the mercury-like energy to surge into the world. Under the sheer weight of the energy, ancient sage Yin Qing was crushed into the ground. As if there was a mountain weighing down on him, he was unable to move at all. The others were not faring too well either. As Kong Shiyao had activated her bloodline ability, she was still able to somewhat hold her ground. On the other hand, Yin Shui's face paled as his skin swiftly ripped apart under the pressure, revealing his crimson flesh underneath. Zhang Xian was also affected by the mercury-like energy too, but it was not too severe for him. He was the strongest among the ancient sages present, and he had sealed his acupoints beforehand to prevent any of that energy from getting into his body. So the damage that he sustained ended up being the least of all. Kacha! 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 The deity fought with ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse, but with each blow executed, the strength that the corpse commanded dwindled. On the other hand, with the mercury-like energy suffusing the area, the deity seemed to be growing stronger by the moment. By the 8th blow, there was a resounding explosion as the corpse was sent flying back into the coffin. Bloodline ignition. With crimson eyes, Kong Shiyao roared wrathfully as she began igniting her bloodline once more. But this time around, before she could finish her move, the deity sneered coldly. Save your effort on this futile struggle. Just because I need you alive doesn't mean that I'll overlook your insolence. Following which, another palm strike descended from the rift. Pooh! Kong Shiyao's body immediately plummeted from the sky from the impact. Bearing the risk of his meridians ripping apart, Yin Shui forcefully drove his Jinqi to catch her. Ha ha ha! After knocking back ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse and striking down Kong Shiyao, the deity laughed heartily as he finally pushed himself out of the rift and floated in the air with his hands crossed triumphantly before his chest. The reason he had been troubled climbing out of the dimension barrier earlier was due to the formation obstructing his path. However, with the formation swiftly crumbling under the influx of the mercury-like energy, there was no longer anything that could stop him. I was curious as to what kind of environment could give birth to such an overpowered individual, but I must say that I'm very disappointed by what I'm seeing here. The deity sneered coldly as he reached out to grab Kong Shiyao. Alarmed, Yin Shui rushed forward to pull Kong Shiyao back, but he was sent flying with a simple flick of a finger. He crashed onto the ground, and the bones in his body shattered from the impact. You're coming with me, the deity commanded. Hula! He wrapped Kong Shiyao with a membrane of energy trapping her. No! Seeing how the only descendant of Kong Shi to possess a bloodline purity of 8, over the past 1,000 years getting captured, everyone's eyes widened in horror. But with the huge disparity of power between them and the enemy, there was nothing they could do. They had already tried everything that was at their disposal, but it was futile. Is the Kungsa domain that Kong Shi created going to be destroyed in my generation? How could I allow this to happen? Ancient sage Yin Qing trembled intensely as he shook his head in disbelief, unwilling to accept reality. Back then, even though Kong Shi had spared the otherworldly demonic tribe out of magnanimity, he had been convinced that mankind would only grow stronger with time, and that they would be able to overcome any threats that came their way. However, not even the great Kong Shi had expected the aeon of ancient sage to suddenly vanish from the world. This phenomenon had turned the tables around, and all of a sudden, mankind had been put in a precarious position once more. Even though they had successfully curbed the threat of the otherworldly demonic tribe, mankind was still unable to return to its golden era. Had it been before the emergence of the Temple of Confucius, there would have been no way anyone would have been able to bypass the dimension barrier. However, with the destruction of the Temple of Confucius, the formation sealing the dimension barrier was growing weaker with each passing moment. Even if they expended all of their lifespans right now to augment the barrier, it would bring them nothing more than temporary relief. Would things have been any different if that man was there? At this moment, ancient sage Yin Qing could not help but think of the celestial master teacher known as Zhang Xian. That fellow might have been young, but he had produced miracles time and time again. Based on what he knew, that fellow had managed to kill a deity that Sovereign Chen Ling had summoned a deity through a ritual. If that fellow was with them, would he have been able to kill the deity before them? Would he have been able to save the 100 schools of philosophers from the impending crisis that was lying just ahead of them? These are all futile thoughts. He isn't here, and our relationship with him is poor. Ancient sage Yin Qing shook his head helplessly, putting aside that there was no way outsiders would be able to get in there. Even if that man was there, it was likely that he would be reluctant to help them. While they shared the common goal of freeing mankind from the threat of the otherworldly demonic tribe, their difference in values had caused several clashes between one another, resulting in the deterioration of their relations. Even if I lose my life today, I have to save Kong Shiyao at any cost. She's the hope of the 100 schools of philosophers, so nothing bad can come to her. Knowing that it was meaningless to think about all that, ancient sage Yin Qing gathered the final dregs of his strength, hoping to launch a decisive attack that would at least buy Kong Shuyao some time to make her escape. But at this moment, a cold glint suddenly flashed through the air. As swift as lightning, it darted right toward the deity's throat. Taken aback by the sudden emergence of such an expert, ancient sage Yin Qing was taken aback. He hurriedly took a closer look, and a lofty figure appeared in his sight. It was a sight that he would never be able to erase from his mind. It's Zhang Xian. He's here. Ancient sage Yin Qing had thought that they were goners, but against all odds, the person whom they had a complicated relationship with, Zhang Xian, suddenly appeared at this moment and charged toward the deity without any hesitation. Looking at the splendid spearmanship that he might never be able to reach in his lifetime, ancient sage Yin Qing sighed deeply in embarrassment. I guess he's a greater master teacher than I'll ever be. For mankind, personal grudges are nothing to him at all. I wronged him. For mankind, the other party was willing to bear the criticism of the world and fake his own death, so as to sneak into the midst of the otherworldly demonic tribe and quell the threat. This spoke volumes of his character. How could such a noble person possibly leave them in the lurch when crisis truly hit? While ancient sage Yin Qing was lamenting over his own misjudgment, Kong Shuyao and the others were awestruck by Zhang Xian's attack. They were unable to find the words to describe how powerful that spear thrust was. It was perfectly aligned with nature, making the movements feel extremely smooth. In that instant, their pain and frailty seemed to have disappeared from their minds. The only thing that their attention was on was the beauty of the spear. The deity floating in the air was stunned as well. He did not think that there would be such a powerful adversary in this lower dimension. In his moment of hesitation, the spear had already arrived before his throat. Puha! Fresh blood splattered as the spear pierced through his skin. However, barely after entering an inch, it was as if he had struck a metal plate. No matter how hard Zhang Xian pushed, he was unable to thrust his spear any deeper. I never would have thought that this scarce environment could give birth to an expert of your caliber. Not bad. Not bad at all. I'll take you along with me too. With a cold sneer, the deity grabbed the spear that was in his throat. In response, Zhang Xian swiftly flicked the spear, and it warped into a massive black dragon that wrapped itself tightly around the deity's body. Taken aback by this move, the deity was stunned for an instant before fury filled his mind. How could he, an expert from the Azure, possibly be trapped by a mere being from a lower dimension? This was an insult to him. You're asking for it. His muscles bulged out as he exerted his might in both of his arms. He was intending to crush the black dragon when a massive brick suddenly fell down from the sky and smacked him right in the face. Pung! Previously, Zhang Xian had forged the Golden Origin Cauldron into a sempiternal realm consummation artifact. Over the past month in the otherworldly demonic tribe, he had allowed it to absorb the aeon of ancient sage inside the painting, and it did not take long before it managed to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage realm. While it was still miles away from reaching the Dimension Shatterer realm, with its astounding weight and remarkably resilient material, it was still able to inflict some damage to the deity through a direct hit on his head. The direct hit rendered the deity momentarily dazed as a ringing sound persisted in his ear. Just as the deity was going to blow his top, the brick suddenly spoke up. Let me just clarify this in advance. I am not a brick but a cauldron. What struck your face was my bottom. Following which, the Golden Origin Cauldron did not forget to wiggle its bottom on the other party's face to emphasize its point. Kong Shuyao and the others were stunned by what they had just seen. Why would such a powerful expert have such an underhanded and seemingly lewd artifact? Furthermore, that fellow actually said that it was a cauldron. The heck, do you even know what a cauldron is? You are obviously a brick. There's not a single part to you that looks like a cauldron at all. Or are we getting behind times? Feeling the cauldron rubbing its bottom on his face, the deity went berserk. Scram! Boom! A powerful shockwave burst forth from the deity, causing the Golden Origin Cauldron and the Dragonbone Divine Spear to be sent flying. The latter swiftly warped back into a spear before returning to Zhang Xian's grasp. Dong! The furious deity landed a fist on the golden origin cauldron's body. My bottom! The golden origin cauldron yelped as it spun anxiously on the ground, as if trying to reshape its dented bottom. You bastard! I've changed my mind. I'm going to slaughter you. The face of the deity twitched a little as he glared at Zhang Xian. Without any hesitation, he lifted his palm and thrust it down upon the latter. On the other hand, Zhang Xian quickly activated the Zhang clan's bloodline and flitted several hundred meters away in an instant. Then, he brandished his spear and charged toward the deity once more. Time quintessence. Seeing how the young man seemingly teleported away to dodge his attack, the deity harumphed disdainfully. He raised his hand with the intention to wrap the young man in his energy, so as to seal his movements. But clanging sounds suddenly echoed in the air above at that moment. Raising his head, he could not help but narrow his eyes in alarm. At some point countless weapons had filled the sky, be it swords, sabers, hammers, spears. All in all, there were several hundred of them. Voila! Those weapons immediately descended to launch a flurry of attacks on the deity. Do you think that these trash weapons can hurt me? The deity scoffed in disdain. With a mere glance, he was able to tell that those weapons were all great sage artifacts. Not a single one of them had reached ancient sage. Putting aside defeating him, none of these weapons would even be able to pierce his skin. Well, I'm not banking on them hurting you either, Zhang Xian replied nonchalantly. He had gathered those weapons from the otherworldly demons that he had killed back at the Temple of Confucius. Placed on the market, they were artifacts that were highly sought after by other cultivators, but they were insufficient to harm ordinary ancient sages, let alone those who were at the Dimension Shatterer realm. You aren't banking on them? The deity was slightly taken aback. He was unable to figure out what Zhang Xian's intentions were. At this moment, the deity suddenly felt a coldness beneath him once more. Lowering his head, he saw the spear from earlier warping into a black dragon, once more to trap him tightly, sealing his movements for a moment. You! The deity bellowed with gritted teeth. In the end, the attack from all of those weapons was just a distraction for the spear to trap him once more. But so what? Even if they had him trapped temporarily, there was nothing that they could do to him. As long as he exerted his full strength, he would be able to swiftly break free from his restraints. It would be interesting to see how many times this black dragon could do this before it was broken into pieces. While the spear had been tempered many times, its cultivation was still far beneath his. Each time it was jolted away, it would sustain significant damage. With his eye of discernment, he could tell that the spear could only do this for another 5 times at the very most. Just as he was about to knock the spear away once more, the young man suddenly lowered his head and said, You are Kong Shiyao, right? Lend me your sword. My sword. Kong Shiyao was stunned. Nevertheless, knowing how urgent the situation was, she did not hesitate to pass her sword over. Knowing that the young man was intending to use her sword in the battle, Kong Shiyao hurriedly said, My sword is a treasure passed down within our Kong clan. Those who don't possess our bloodline won't be able to assimilate it. If you wish to use it, I can lend you a droplet of my blood. This sword had been forged by one of the best blacksmiths in the 100 schools of philosophers. The sword had already reached blood reincarnation realm consummation, a mere step away from reaching the Dimension Shatterer realm. Those who did not possess a sufficiently pure bloodline would not even be able to move the sword. It had taken her nearly 3 years before she was able to assimilate the sword and use a portion of its prowess. If the young man before her wished to use it, he would need to use her blood as a medium to temporarily tame the sword. We don't have time for that now, Zhang Xian replied as he flicked his wrist powerfully. Wang! A crisp sound echoed by the sword, and the next moment, it bowed down before Zhang Xian, almost like a loyal, domesticated dog. Why, you've already tamed it? Kong Shiyao's mouth widened in disbelief. With Zhang Xian's capabilities, taming a blood reincarnation realm consummation, sword was a piece of cake. After assimilating the sword, he raised it high in the air and hacked it down upon the trapped deity. Dang! There was a resounding clang as sparks rubbed off the top of the deity's head. A layer of skin fell to the ground. Ah! The eyes of the deity turned scarlet with rage. On the other hand, Kong Shiryao widened her eyes as she muttered incredulously. That's not how you are supposed to use a sword. The greatest strength of a sword lay in its swiftness, but that fellow actually used it as a hacking tool instead. Even the best of weapon would eventually spoil under such misuse. Dang dang dang. In a single breath, Zhang Xian executed over 100 hacks all on the same spot, causing a laceration to appear on the deity's skull. It was so deep that one could almost see his brain. Boom! Overflowing with the rage from being humiliated, the deity released a massive outburst of power, once more, and sent the dragonbone divine spear flying. He turned to Zhang Xian, intending to slaughter that arrogant young man, who dared lay his hands on him, when a brick suddenly fell on his face once more. This time, the brick descended upon the laceration on his head, causing blood to spurt out like a fountain. The heck? The deity nearly lost his mind. That fellow's fighting style was really the epitome of underhandedness and despicableness. We are all top-notch experts. Shouldn't you show some honor in your fighting style? We should be crossing swords valiantly with one another instead of throwing out everything at our disposal, as though we are mere ruffians. Your image is crumbling, you know. Infuriated, the deity shook off the brick and turned his gaze once more toward Zhang Xian, only to see that the latter had fled far away using his bloodline ability. Trembling with rage, the deity turned his sights to ancient sage Yan Qing and the others and bellowed, "Since you wish to play games with me, I'll start by slaughtering the lot of them." He needed Kong Shiryao alive for his own purposes, but as for the other ancient sages, their lives meant nothing to him at all. Thus, the deity thrust his palm downward, but once again, before his palm could connect, a spear suddenly stood in its path and halted its movements. Zhang Xian stood right before the deity and wagged his finger provocatively. "Preying on the weak, what a formidable person you are. But I guess there's no other choice, considering that there's nothing you can do about me." Voila! With a wave of his hand, Zhang Xian sent another barrage of weapons flying toward the deity. What cheap taunts! But very well, I shall start with you then. With a cold glint in his eyes, the deity began dashing forth. His movements were not too fast, but every step that he took caused a tremendous pulsation of energy that collapsed the space in the surroundings, rendering it impossible for others to traverse across wherever he had been through. He had to admit that his speed was lacking in comparison to Zhang Xian, but as long as he shattered the space in the surroundings, the latter would have nowhere to escape to. What a distasteful move! Zhang Xian's lips twitched. He turned to ancient sage Yan Qing and the others and said, "You lot should make use of this opportunity to recuperate and heal up. I'll handle him for the time being." Following which, he began flitting away into the distance once more. On the other hand, seeing that Zhang Xian was fleeing into the distance once again, the deity glanced at Kong Shiryao, intending on making use of this opportunity to capture her once more. However, as if having read his mind, Zhang Xian suddenly turned around and launched a counterattack. The brick, sword, and spear all flew right toward him, prepared to slip in through the cracks of his defense at any moment to harass him. At the same time, several corpses flew over and exploded right in his face. Finally, the deity reached the limits of his patience and began chasing Zhang Xian like a crazed dog. As long as that fellow remained alive, it would only be a matter of time before he was driven insane by the other party. It seemed like he would really have to get rid of that fellow first. Boom boom boom. Just like that, the two of them began on a seemingly endless chase. From time to time, the one fleeing would turn around and launch a couple of attacks before fleeing once more, leaving the one chasing more enraged than ever. The battle between the two of them caused the whole of the Kungsu domain to rattle ceaselessly. Pung! Yet another scholastic master was sent flying. Standing on the spot, Fan Xiaoxu scanned his surroundings with a forlorn look on his face, reminiscent of an expert lamenting the lack of a rival in the world. "Is there anyone else who wants to test my strength?" Mi Xian and the others were the first few who had rushed over to welcome the freshman, so there were still a couple of scholastic masters who were not there yet. Upon hearing that a powerful freshman had arrived at the academy, they swiftly made their way over, suppressed their cultivation, and challenged the other party to a battle. To their dismay, they found that none of them were able to survive a single blow from the other party. More importantly, Fan Xiaoxiu seemed to be further refining his skills over the course of the battle, causing his fighting prowess to swiftly grow. By now, there was no one who could match him in his cultivation realm. In fact, even those a realm stronger than him were no match for him. There's no need for that. It'll be meaningless to continue the battles at this point. Zheng Qing shook his head and sighed deeply. The result could not have been any clearer. None of them was a match for Fan Xiaoxiu. Fan Xiaoxiu scanned the crowd around him and asked, "Then, who should I choose as my teacher?" While he had defeated all of these scholastic masters, it still did not change the fact that he was only a St. Nine Dan freshman and needed a teacher to guide him around. "I'm unqualified for the role. I don't think that I have the ability to become your teacher." The defeated crowd lowered their faces in embarrassment. They would have loved more than anything to accept a powerful student as their direct disciple. But considering how they could not even defeat the young man, what right did they have to teach him? Anyone whom Fan Xiaoxiu laid his eyes on would swiftly avert their gaze awkwardly. Some time passed, but not a single person spoke up. The surroundings were as silent as a graveyard. Expecting such an outcome to his words, Fan Xiaoxiu finally spoke up with a smile on his face. "Actually, I already have a teacher in mind, but I'm not sure if I will be able to come under his tutelage." Seeing a ray of hope to free themselves from this awkward situation, the scholastic masters in the area quickly asked, "May I know who it is?" At this point in time, they would do anything to get out of this terribly uncomfortable situation. "He goes by the name of Zhang Xian. However, I'm not too sure whether that is his real name or not." Fan Xiaoxiu replied, "Zhang Xian? Is there anyone in the great frontistery of Confucianism who goes by the surname of Zhang?" Zheng Qing was startled. Those in the great frontistery of Confucianism all came from the lineage of the 100 schools of philosophers. So how could there be a Zhang around? Nangong Yuanfeng suddenly stepped forward and said, "That name sounds rather familiar. I do know of a Zhang Xian in this world, but I'm not sure if we are referring to the same person." While not many in the Kungsa domain would have heard of Zhang Xian, that name was practically a household name on the master-teacher continent. Zheng Qing and Fan Xiaoxiu quickly turned their curious gazes over. This man isn't from the 100 schools of philosophers. Instead, he's a powerful master-teacher from the master-teacher continent, as well as the head of the Zhang clan. The reason we failed to acquire the celestial amulets of legacy back, then as per the requirements of our mission, was due to his interference. Nangong Yuanfeng said, "Ah, that Zhang Xian?" Zheng Qing widened his eyes in realization. The top echelons of the 100 schools of philosophers had already heard about the happenings in the Temple of Confucius. Based on the information that they had received, almost everything that they had sought to obtain, be it the canvas of 4 seasons or the Bodhi fruit, had ended up getting stolen by him. "How did you hear of his name?" Zheng Qing stared at the young man before him intently. It was deeply suspicious how Fan Xiaoxiu knew of Zhang Xian's name, even though he had spent his entire life in the Kungsa domain. There was likely something deeper to this. Fan Xiaoxiu's body suddenly stiffened as he realized that he had just let something important slip. All along, he had thought that Zhang Xian was an ancient sage of the great frontistery of Confucianism, or at least someone who was close to the academy. But contrary to his expectations, it turned out that the other party was not even from the 100 schools of philosophers. That would explain why the other party had borrowed his identity in order to get in. He had really messed up. "You've never left the Kungsa domain before, so you shouldn't have known of that name. Does this mean that Zhang Xian is currently in the Kungsa domain?" Zheng Qing's eyebrows shot up as a bad premonition struck his mind. Considering how Fan Xiaoxiu and the others had suddenly grown so much stronger, as well as the fact that they actually knew of Zhang Xian's name, the most logical deduction that he could think of was that the renowned master-teacher of the master-teacher continent had somehow managed to find his way into the Kungsa domain. Fan Xiaoxiu was in a quandary. He had no idea how he should respond in such a situation, but it turned out that he did not have to. A split moment later, a deafening rumbling echoed in the air, and the clear sky began to collapse into a void. Everyone hurriedly raised their heads in alarm, only to see two figures fighting one another in the air. Each time they clashed with one another, a gorge formed in the sky that extended over several li. Lightning rained down so furiously that it seemed as if the world would soon collapse under the devastation. "Who the hell are you?" A person with blood dripping down his head bellowed with gritted teeth. "Your grandfather, Zhang Xian," the other person replied gleefully. "He's Zhang Xian." Everyone was stunned. Words could not begin to describe how agitated Fan Xiaoxu felt at that very moment. He had guessed that Zhang Xian was an ancient sage, but he did not think that the other party would be that powerful among the ancient sages. After all, if the other party was truly that powerful, there should not have been any need for the other party to borrow his identity in order to get into the great frontistery of Confucianism. But at that very moment, the sheer might he produced seemed to be too great for even the heavens to contain. It was as if he was a being that had risen above the rules of the world. Pung pung pung. As the two of them crossed blows with one another, lacerations emerged one after another in the sky. The folded space containing the great frontistery of Confucianism was placed under huge strain, and it seemed as if the entire folded space would collapse at any moment. "Ichi Zhang Xian? You actually competed with him back then?" Zhong Qing gulped down a mouthful of saliva as he turned to look at Nangong Yuanfeng. Back then, he passed himself off as a member of the Luo clan, assuming the name of Luo Tianya. However, based on what I heard afterward, he's indeed Zhang Xian. Nangong Yuanfeng nodded as he could not help but tremble in the face of Zhang Xian's incredible might. It had at most been just a few months since he had last seen the young man, right? When in the world did he become so powerful? Not even the great ancient sage, Yin Qing, possessed such tremendous strength. If this was the power that the young man had wielded back then, he could have been killed with just a simple flick of the young man's finger. It seemed like the young man had truly been merciful to him. Sila. In his moment of shock, the fighting duo had already torn through the space of the great frontistery of Confucianism and vanished from sight. The next moment, the two of them were standing above a vast mountain range. Over there, the examinees who had just cleared the test were trying their best to decipher the formation on the jade tokens that they had been given, when a loud rumble suddenly echoed in the sky. They raised their heads, and they were welcomed with a sight that they would never forget in their entire life. Two experts bathed in lightning were clashing intensely with one another. Every strike from them made the entire world tremble. It was almost as if the end of the world had arrived. One of them had a head completely bathed in crimson blood, and he had a frenzied expression on his face that looked as if he would blow up from all of the rage that he had accumulated within. On the other hand, the other young man had a composed smile on his lips, and he brandished the sword in his grasp with grace. Are the two of them ancient sages? There's probably no one in the world who commands such tremendous strength other than the ancient sages. But why would the two ancient sages be fighting with one another? It looks as if they are fighting one another to the death. I don't know either. They might have some grudge with one another. A huge commotion broke out beneath. With fists clenched tightly by their sides, the examinees stared at the majestic battle unfolding before them with envy in their eyes. This was what they had been cultivating all their lives for. From the moment they took the first whiff of spiritual energy into their body and converted it into jinqi, it had already become their lifelong pursuit to acquire greater strength. The tremendous strength that was right before their eyes could be said to be their terminal goal. It represented the top of the world to them. "Don't you dare hurt our teacher." At this moment, two voices reverberated in the air before two youths younger than them rushed into the air. The lightning in the air immediately became even more intense. Astonishingly, the person with his head bathed in blood was able to stand his ground, even when faced with three opponents simultaneously. After crossing several blows, the two youths who had just joined the fray were sent crashing to the ground. "You aren't a match for him, so don't come over anymore. Don't worry, leave him to me." Zhang Xian said. At the same time, he flicked his wrist and leaped into a dimension rift, disappearing from sight. Where do you think you're going? The deity immediately chased after Zhang Xian, determined not to allow the latter get away. Just like that, the two of them vanished from sight. If not for the countless lacerations in space left in the sky as a result of their fight, they would have thought that everything that they had seen a moment ago was just a dream. You said that they are very likely powerful experts. The head of the stone village looked at the village bell, Xiao Ru, and he shook his head. How could that be possible? If they are really as powerful as you've made them out to be, do you think that it's possible for them to maintain such politeness with us, and even offer to compensate us for the losses in our fields? It was as if the village bell's mind had not been working right ever since she returned from the short journey with those 3 guests. As soon as she returned, she had gone around telling everyone that the 3 guests that had been there not too long ago were actually Saint Realm experts. Of course, there was no one in the stone village who would believe such ludicrous news. There was no way that a Saint Realm expert would be so courteous to them, going to the extent of offering to compensate for their losses. Besides, if they were really Saint Realm experts, they could have just flown all the way to Fan City. Why would they waste their time riding on Xiao Ru's tamed aerial spirit beast? In their view, Saint Realm experts were domineering and authoritative. They were being so far above them that even crossing them would have warranted the death penalty. They simply could not imagine an amiable Saint Realm cultivator. It's true. Why won't any of you believe me? I saw them flying in the sky without any external support with my own eyes. And they flew at an incredible speed. Xiao Ru exclaimed in exasperation. It was so frustrating to see everyone acting as if she was blabbering gibberish. She was certain that she had seen the 3 of them vanishing right before her eyes. While she had found it unbelievable at first, she was convinced that they were definitely Saint Realm experts. Had she known that they were Saint Realm experts right from the start, she would not have acted so haughtily. Instead, she would have humbly asked for their guidance in her cultivation. I know that you have great ambitions in mind, but Saint Realm experts only exist within major clans. People like us will never get a chance to see them at all. The village head sighed deeply as he tried to console Xiao Ru. But at that very moment, the deafening rumbling of thunder filled the air. Everyone quickly raised their heads, and what came into their sights were 2 figures shrouded in lightning. They were crossing blows intensely with one another, and every strike they dashed out tore the fabric of space apart, causing dark rifts to appear all around the surroundings. Isn't that young man? Recognizing one of the 2 figures in the sky, the villagers widened their eyes in shock. It was certain that the young man equipped with a spear fighting in the air was the person whom they had welcomed into their village not too long ago. The village bell had just said that they could very well be Saint Realm experts, and they had thought that it was ridiculous. But what they were witnessing had already far exceeded what saints or even great sages could achieve. He is actually an ancient sage. The village head felt his throat turning dry as he spoke. Even though they were only ordinary villagers who were unqualified to cultivate, they did hear a fair bit about the various cultivation realms and the strength that they commanded. Not even the esteemed great sages in the top echelon of the 100 schools of philosophers could summon such tremendous might. The young man in the sky was definitely an ancient sage, and a very powerful one at that. I actually journeyed together with an ancient sage. But not only did I neglect to learn from him, I even scorned him? The village belle, Xiao Ru, nearly burst into tears at the realization. For the longest time, she had desired to acquire higher cultivation techniques to advance her cultivation, but when the opportunity presented itself, she had actually allowed it to slip through her fingers due to her arrogance. Even though she was highly regarded in the village, she knew that someone of her caliber would never be able to catch the sight of an ancient sage. In an instant, her guts turned green from regret. On that very day, almost everyone in the 100 schools of philosophers witnessed the intense fight in the sky between those 2 top experts, and their silhouettes were imprinted deep in their minds. Even tens of thousands of years later, the incident would remain an undying legend. Why can't I find anywhere that's empty? Zhang Xian frowned with a troubled look on his face. He did not run about just to show off his strength. It was just that he was unable to find a sufficiently remote place to release all of his finishers at once. The world that the 100 schools of philosophers lived in was simply too crowded. He did not like the idea of exposing his trump cards, even to his own comrades. Thus, he could only continuously retreat while fending the deity off. Sometime later, they finally arrived at a relatively empty mountain range. Finally, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed like effort did pay off in the end. He quickly threw down a bunch of formation flags and sealed the surroundings so as to prevent his aura from leaking out. Oh, you aren't going to run anymore? I assume that you have resigned yourself to your fate. The deity scoffed when he saw that the young man was not escaping anymore. He had not been blindly chasing Zhang Xian around. During his pursuit, he had been able to fully ascertain the extent of Zhang Xian's abilities, and he was confident that he would be able to kill the latter easily, as long as the latter stopped running away. Resign myself to my fate? Aren't you jumping too quickly to conclusions? Well, it just happens that I have a twin brother who wishes to meet you. As Zhang Xian said those words, he flicked his wrist. Who? A figure identical to Zhang Xian appeared right next to him. Twin brother. Seeing the appearance of another figure with an identical appearance and soul aura, the deity was stunned for a moment before a knowing smile crept onto his lips. This is your clone, right? Spectacularly made, I must say. For a clone to possess strength identical to the main body, it must have been made using some kind of invaluable material. Wonderful. I shall claim it for myself. There were cultivators in the Azure who created their own clones to augment their fighting prowess, but most of them were just look-alike puppets that were similar to the main body in form. The clone that was standing right before him actually possessed a unique soul. This meant that the material used to create the clone was of extremely high quality, even by the standards of the Azure. If he could acquire such a treasure for himself and forge his own clone, his fighting prowess would effectively double in an instant. With reddened eyes, he pointed at the clone in front of him and spoke with quivering lips. From this day forth, you shall be mine as well. Boom! Torrential energy poured out toward Zhang Xian's clone. But before it could even reach the latter, the deity saw a blur in his field of vision. Before he knew it, the clone was already standing in front of him, and a leg was flying toward his face. With a haughty look on his face, the clone demanded, "Who the hell are you? The likes of you actually think that you would be able to tame me?" You. With twitching lips, the deity swiftly grabbed the clone's leg to stop the attack, when the latter's other leg came flying from the opposite direction. Pung! Just like that, the deity was knocked back as his cheekbone sunk inward from the powerful impact. What? How is this possible? The deity was stunned by the earlier strike. It was not due to the damage that he had sustained, but by the sheer disbelief at how powerful the kick had been. The clones that he had seen thus far had always been weaker than the main body. But why would this person's clone be even stronger than the main body itself? How in the world did this even work? It was illogical. You sure make a huge fuss out of nothing. My main body is a weakling, so how could he begin to compare to me? The clone smirked as he charged toward the deity once more, whipping his leg over at a terrifying speed. As Zhang Xian had been suppressing his cultivation, he was still at sempiternal realm consummation. However, it was different for the clone. As a god artifact, there was no need for him to suppress his cultivation at all. A month ago, he had already pushed for a breakthrough to Ancient Sage, using the Aeon of Ancient Sage, making him a full-fledged blood reincarnation realm expert. Even when they were in the same cultivation realm, Zhang Xian was no match for his clone, let alone the fact that there was a gap of 3 entire realms between them. If Zhang Xian had a fight with his clone, he would barely be able to protect himself with the Dragonbone Divine Spear in hand. Slowly, the surprised look on the deity warped into feverish excitement as he began laughing maniacally. Ha 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 ha. The heavens are really shining on me. Now I am more determined than ever to make you mine. With a piercing cry, he leaped forward to meet the clone's attack. He gathered all of his strength together in order to suppress this show-off of a clone once and for all when a shadow was suddenly cast over him. He hurriedly retreated in alarm before looking upward. It was a massive book, following which, a pitch-black palm shot out from the book and darted right for his face. Pa! This strike caused him to spin around twice on the spot, as fresh blood spewed all over the area. What the heck is this? The deity was a little astonished by all of the trump cards that Zhang Xian had up his sleeves. Just what other things did the other party have in store? First the spear, the sword, and the brick, and shortly after, the clone, and now a book was joining the battle. More importantly, he could sense incredible pulsations of energy coming from within the book. There was some kind of existence that possessed strength comparable to him sealed within. Who? In that moment of astonishment, Zhang Xian charged forward with a spear in his left hand and a sword in his right hand. Brandishing the two weapons with surprising coordination, he was actually able to throw the deity into a fluster for a brief moment through the bizarre combination of attacks. Meanwhile, his clone and Vicious quickly rushed forward to further pressure the deity. Pung 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 pung. Under the relentless assault, it did not take long for the deity to be struck by several hundred times, and the impact sustained caused his bones to shatter and internal organs to shift. There was not a spot on his body that remained unharmed. No, this can't be happening. For the first time throughout the entire battle, the deity tasted fear. He had rushed over when he noticed the weakening of the dimension barrier, because he had thought that he would be able to acquire some rare treasures. But who could have known that he would end up being cornered in this lower dimension? Even Zhang Xian himself was already a tricky opponent to deal with, let alone having to simultaneously cope with another two experts who boasted strength similar to his. How could he win against such a lineup? In the depths of his heart, the deity began to despair. He knew that he could not allow the battle to continue any further. He had to escape. Thus, he gathered all of his energy seemingly with the intention to launch a desperate counterattack, causing the other three to immediately go on the defensive. However, it was in fact a feint. With no one tying him down, he immediately turned tail and ran away. However, before he could get far, the world suddenly turned dark. He barely had time to glance upward before a massive brick crushed down on his head once more. It was as if this fellow had been biding his time in the sky all along, waiting for the ideal opportunity to smash his face. Pung! While this smash did not deal a fatal blow to the deity, it did throw him off for a moment. This momentary lapse in attention turned out to be his undoing. The next instant, a spear and a sword pierced through his chest. Right after, a fist smashed right into his head, and a black hand stabbed into his heart. Putong! Even down to his last breath, there was an incredulous look on the deity's face, as if he could not believe that a superior being like him had been defeated by mere ants. As the last breath escaped his lips, his body grew limp, and he began plummeting from the sky. It would be a waste to leave the blood and body of an expert of such caliber lying around, Zhang Xian thought as he quickly stowed the corpse of the deity into the myriad ant-hive nest. Following which he heaved a deep sigh of relief. The battle was finally over. No matter what, the enemy that he had faced was a true Dimension Shatterer realm expert. Had he made any mistakes over the course of the battle, he would have been destroyed in an instant. As such, he had pushed his concentration to its very limits throughout the entire duration. Nevertheless, the rewards from the battle were well worth the fight. The deity's blood and body would surely prove vital for his breakthrough to Ancient Sage in the future. Placing his clone and Vicious back into the myriad ant-hive nest, Zhang Xian turned his sight to the mountain range, where the void was, and stared silently for a moment before making his way back. On the elevated platform in the midst of the mountain range, Ancient Sage Yanqing finally struggled to his feet. He looked at the massive rifts around him with a worried look on his face. At that moment, Kong Shiyao suddenly flew over and asked, "Ancient Sage Yanqing, was that young man the celestial master teacher you previously mentioned, Zhang Xian?" Having overexerted her bloodline ability, her face was horrifyingly pale as well. It took everything she had just to maintain her flight. "That's right," Ancient Sage Yanqing replied with a nod. "He's truly an extraordinary individual." Kong Shiyao nodded in awe. She had been blessed with a powerful bloodline at birth, so there had been no one who was able to compete with her in terms of talent. She had been confident that there was no one beneath Ancient Sage who would be stronger than her. But from the earlier battle, it was clear that the young man's fighting prowess exceeded even hers. Ever since she heard of Zhang Xian's existence, she had been wanting to meet and compete with him. She had thought that she could have a duel with him after achieving a breakthrough to Ancient Sage. However, from the looks of it, there was no need for that. Even after using her bloodline ability, she had been unable to stop the deity's movements. On the other hand, the young man was able to battle the deity on equal footing, and even lure him away. It was apparent from this that there was a gap between their abilities. There's no denying that Zhang Xian is formidable, but he's still lacking in comparison to the deity from the Azure. I fear that he's in peril, one of the ancient sages remarked worriedly. Given our current condition, there's nothing we can do to help him. Even stabilizing the formation is impossible for us at the moment. The ancient sages had already been reduced to a skeletal rack at the moment, and they would die soon enough without any aeon of ancient sage to replenish his energy. Given their states, there was nothing that they could do to help. Knowing this, ancient sage Yinqing also shook his head. While the deity had been lured away by Zhang Xian, it did not mean that the danger was over. The formation that was sustained by ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse had been opened, and the mercury-like energy was rapidly pouring in. If they did not seal the rifts quickly, everyone in the Kungsa domain would soon die from taking in that incredibly heavy energy. Their entire populace was at stake. It's fortunate that this energy doesn't diffuse too quickly due to its weight. What's more urgent is for us to get rid of that deity, or else anything we do will be futile, Kang Shiyao said. As long as they sealed their acupoints, they would be able to bear with the mercury-like energy in the short term. However, as long as the deity remained alive, his existence would be like a guillotine hanging right above them, ready to snap down at any moment. You're right. Even at the cost of our lives, we must eradicate that deity. Everyone nodded grimly in agreement. Gathering the last bits of their strength, they were going to move in the direction that Zhang Xian had disappeared in when a young man approached with a nonchalant look on his face. He was dressed in a clean white robe that was completely devoid of dust. There was no hint of blood or wounds on his body, making it seem as if he had left earlier not to battle, but to go on a leisurely holiday. Who else could that young man be other than Zhang Xian? Why, you're fine. What happened to the deity? Did you kill him? Everyone asked anxiously. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine, Zhang Xian replied with a smile. As for the deity, you need not worry about him anymore. On his way here, he had washed himself with clear water to quickly clean up a little before switching into a fresh set of clothes. Even though he had not sustained any injuries, he had sweated a fair bit over the course of the battle, and the feeling of fabric clinging stickily to his skin felt very uncomfortable to him. Time ticked by in silence. It was quite a while before the crowd was able to take in the news that the young man had successfully gotten rid of the deity, and looks of awe appeared on their faces. To defeat a person so powerful without sustaining any injuries, the young man was frighteningly powerful. Taking a deep breath to recover from his shock, ancient sage Yinqing took a look at the rifts around him, before looking at Zhang Xian with an awkward expression on his face. Zhang Shi, I understand that you have unique insights into formations, so may I trouble you to mend our formation for us? He knew that the current 100 schools of philosophers lacked the ability to mend the shattered formation, but the young man before him should be able to pull it off. It was just that the young man was an outsider, and the relations between them could not be said to be amicable. Furthermore, it was just a moment ago that the young man had done them a huge favor by luring away the deity and getting rid of him despite the risks. So he could not help but feel a little embarrassed for relying so much on the other party. It's no trouble at all, but do you have the blueprint and repair method for the formation? Zhang Xian asked. This was the first time that he had seen a formation like this. Using the corpse of ancient sage Ziyuan as its core to seal the passageway leading to a higher dimension, its complexity was way beyond any of the formations that he had seen before. Even he would have had difficulties trying to set it up without the blueprint. We do, ancient sage Yinqing replied as he passed a jade token over. Recorded in here is the structure of the formation, as well as the notes that generations of our predecessors have made while repairing the formation. Taking the jade token, Zhang Xian quickly scanned through its contents. It did not take long for him to have the entire formation in his grasp. The name of this formation was very literal, Floating Coffin Heaven Mending Formation. It was said to have been created by Kong Shi himself, in order to seal up the passageway, linking the higher dimension to their world. Once it was in place, even Dimension Shatterer Realm cultivators would have trouble trying to breach it. Is he going to attempt to mend the formation after learning it on the spot? Could it be that his talents in his supporting occupation are on par with mine? Is he able to master anything within moments of coming into contact with it too? Kong Shiyao frowned in intrigue. Possessing the purest bloodline of Kong Shi, her ability to absorb new information was amazing. Be it for a supporting occupation or a battle technique, she could understand and master it swiftly after learning the principles behind it. She did not have to devote too much time to refining her skills. It was bewildering to her how the young man had the confidence to accept their request without any hesitation despite having never seen the formation before. It could not be that he possessed the same talents as her, could it? But even if he has talents comparable to mine, such a complex formation should at least take him 2 to 3 days to master. Will he be able to make it in time at this rate? Kong Shiyao thought worriedly, as she looked at the mercury-like energy gushing in from the rifts. Recalling the fact that the young man was a celestial master teacher just like Kong Shi, it should not come as any surprise that the young man was extraordinary. However, there were still limits to what a human could achieve within a limited time frame. The Floating Coffin Heaven Mending Formation was so complicated that it had taken her 3 days before she was able to grasp how the entire system worked. Even if the young man was more gifted and could grasp new information 2 times swifter than her, he still would not be able to mend the formation in time. The mercury-like energy had only suffused the elevated platform that they were on, but at the current rate it was flowing out, it would drown at least 1/3 of the Kungsa domain's land by the end of the day. That would cause a rapid change in the quality of the spiritual energy within the world, and the green sprout wheat that they had cultivated with great difficulty would swiftly die off. Everything that the 100 schools of philosophers had built up over the past tens of thousands of years would be reduced to nothing. Then, everything would be for naught even if they did manage to repair the formation. Besides, they were betting on the possibility that the young man would have some way to repair it. But that was unjustified optimism on their part. It could be said that making this request to the young man was really a last-ditch gamble. But as Kong Shiyao continued looking on worriedly, she saw Zhang Xian passing the jade token back to her. Following which, he turned to the crowd with a confident smile on his face. "I'm going to begin the repairs now, so please step back." Hearing those words, Kong Shiyao blinked blankly. She raised her right hand and swiftly counted 3 breaths. Had he really grasped the formation in just 3 breaths? Under her bewildered stare, the young man began moving. He opened his fingers wide and pumped his jinqi toward the sky like a rapid current, swiftly forming illusory bridges of a myriad colors across the void. Standing in the very middle of those seemingly divine bridges, Zhang Xian looked as if he was the ruler of the world. He gently moved his finger to maneuver those illusory bridges, reminiscent of a demonic tennis performing a moving melody. Along with his movements, a faint but beautiful humming from the wind could be heard. Is that the voice of the heavens? Kong Shiyao trembled. Legend had it that if anyone achieved the level of perfect harmony with the heavens, no matter which occupation they were from, the voice of the heavens would emerge. The young man had only browsed through the blueprint for 3 breaths, but not only did he manage to grasp the formation perfectly, he was even able to elevate it to a much higher level. Was she really so lacking compared to him? But she was the descendant of the legendary Kong Shi, possessing a bloodline that none could match. With deep indignation, she looked on and saw Zhang Xian's fingers moving faster and faster, and it did not take long for afterimages to appear in the midst of his movements. The illusory bridges danced elegantly in the air, crossing one another to swiftly form an intricate design. He's speeding up? Isn't he afraid of making a mistake? Kong Shiyao shuddered at the sheer speed that Zhang Xian was moving at. Given the complexity of the formation, she had thought that even if Zhang Xian could comprehend it, he would need their help to form the primary structure, to seal off the inflow of the mercury-like energy before slowly reinforcing it. All in all, she had expected the entire process to take a whole month. However, at that moment, Zhang Xian's hands were moving so quickly that she could hardly keep up with them anymore. If he made a single mistake, not only would his previous work be unraveled, he would also suffer a severe backlash from the formation. A few breaths passed, but not only did Zhang Xian's movements not slow down, they continued still to grow swifter. Unable to stand the tension any longer, Kong Shiyao flicked her wrist and took out a mirror. She gently reflected it against Zhang Xian. This mirror was a family heirloom passed down in the Kong clan, and it was known as the Profound Empyrean Mirror. Through analyzing the intensity of the pulsations of energy coming from the formation, it was able to determine whether the formation master's movements were correct or not. If the formation master's movements were correct, the character's correct would be reflected in the mirror, and a white light would emanate from its surface. Incorrect, and the character's wrong would be reflected, with black light emanating from its surface. Wang wang wang. Upon reflecting Zhang Xian's silhouette, the Profound Empyrean Mirror immediately emanated a brilliant white glow as lines and lines of characters swiftly flowed across its surface. As the Profound Empyrean Mirror in her hand got filled up with the characters, its surface glowed so brightly that it seemed to become a mini sun that blinded everyone in the surroundings. Kong Shiyao's lips quivered in disbelief. She had seen plenty of geniuses in her lifetime, and she was one herself. But to master such a complex formation within 3 breaths, and repair it so quickly without making the slightest mistake. Was that young man really a human? Who? Her astonishment did not last for long before the fingers of the young man in the air came to an abrupt halt. He gracefully placed his hands behind his back before gazing into the void. What's wrong? The formation's repairs mustn't be halted halfway through, or else you will have to start anew. Kong Shiyao yelled anxiously. The formation was not just complex. The repairs must also be finished at a single go. Otherwise, if there was even a momentary interruption in between, the mercury-like energy would swiftly crush everything that had been built thus far. This was similar to repairing a dam. One had to finish the repairs in a single shot, or else any weakness in the structure would swiftly be exploited by the accumulated water, eventually resulting in a leakage. I didn't halt the repairs halfway. Hearing those words, Zhang Xian glanced at Kong Shiyao and replied, I have already finished the repairs. You have already finished? Kong Shiyao was taken aback. Given that ancient sage Ziyuan's body was still with her, and the mercury-like energy was still flowing through, how could this be considered as a completed repair job? Noticing Kong Shiyao's incomprehension, Zhang Xian chuckled softly. He looked at the void above once and commanded, Activate. Hong Long. The coffin beside Kong Shiyao immediately soared into the void and vanished, and the surrounding space was swiftly stabilized. All of the rifts were mended in an instant, and it looked as if nothing had happened there at all. The formation had actually activated under his command. The word of law. Isn't that the Kong clan's bloodline ability? Kong Shiyao could not believe what she was seeing. To be able to repair the formation with a single word, could it be that the other party possessed the same bloodline as her, allowing him to use the word of law ability? But very soon, Kong Shiyao realized that was not the case. While the move that Zhang Xian had used appeared similar to the word of law, there were some differences between the two. To be more exact, it was a more advanced use of the impartation of heaven's will. However, this floating coffin heaven-mending formation harnessed the energies of the heavens, so even activating it manually was extremely grueling. How could it possibly be so easily swayed by the impartation of heaven's will? Ancient sage Yanqing, who harbored the same doubts in his mind, swiftly posed the question to Zhang Xian. Well, the formation blueprint you gave me had quite a few problems, so I made some corrections while I was setting up the formation, Zhang Xian replied with a smile. Corrections? Kong Shiyao's body froze in shock. That's not possible. This formation was created by Kong Shi himself, so there's no way there could have been any flaws in it. How could there be any imperfections in the things left behind by Kong Shi? Well, the formation that Kong Shi created didn't have any flaws. The problems originated from the huge changes in the Wuxia domain in the past tens of thousands of years. The formation that Kong Shi created is no longer optimal, given the current environment in the Wuxia domain. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to keep repairing it generation after generation, Zhang Xian said. There was nothing in the world that time could not erode. Without a doubt, the Wuxia domain from tens of thousands of years back was bound to have been very different from what they saw before them. Since even the world had changed, how could formations remain flawless without adapting to the changes? Those words rendered Kong Shiyao speechless as shock swept through her mind once more. The young man's words did make perfect sense, but this was Kong Shi's formation they were talking about. The young man had actually modified Kong Shi's formation. Furthermore, he had even succeeded in doing so. Kong Shiyao felt as if the world was whirling around her. All along, she had never doubted her own talent. She had felt that there was nothing that she was incapable of as long as she gave it her all. However, compared to the monster before her, she felt like she could sprint for her entire life and never catch up with him. On the other hand, seeing that the mercury-like energy had been completely sealed away, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. He turned his gaze away from the stupefied Kong Shiyao to the relatively calmer ancient sage Yanqing and said, "I guess the situation is stable for the time being." Ancient sage Yanqing, may I trouble you to explain the situation to me? He felt like Kong Shiyao was making a huge fuss out of nothing. It was as if she had never seen the larger world out there before. Taking 20 breaths to set up this formation was really no remarkable feat at all. If anything, it was rather slow. If he had achieved a breakthrough to ancient sage, such a thing would not have taken him 2 breaths. Zhang Shi, what do you think of that heavy energy from earlier? Do you think that you will be able to absorb and assimilate it into your body? Ancient sage Yanqing replied with another question. Zhang Xian pondered for a moment before replying. The heavy energy shares some commonalities with spiritual energy, but its sheer weight makes it impossible for anyone from the master-teacher continent to absorb. If I absorb it, the chances are that my meridians will collapse as a result of the weight. Hearing those words, ancient sage Yanqing sighed deeply before saying with a bitter smile, I see. To be honest with you, that heavy energy is the spiritual energy from the azure. Spiritual energy from the azure? That's right. Have you ever wondered why the beings from the azure are so much more powerful than us? That's because the spiritual energy they absorb is very different from ours. It's much more condensed, and being constantly exposed to it has tempered their constitution to the point that even their younglings wield tremendous fighting prowess at birth. Ancient sage Yanqing explained. They actually absorb that heavy spiritual energy? Is it really alright for them to do so? Zhang Xian was stunned. Even with his blood reincarnation realm prowess, he felt as if his internal organs would be crushed if he absorbed just a bit of it. Were the natives of the azure really able to absorb such heavy energy without suffering any backlash? Follow me. Seeing the look on Zhang Xian's face, ancient sage Yanqing turned around and beckoned Zhang Xian to come along with him. Gritting his teeth to endure the frailty he felt, he headed off in a certain direction. He had lost too much blood in the earlier battle, such that he had nearly expended all of his vitality. Even though he was still breathing, he did not have much time left. The two of them flew for quite a while before arriving at a tightly sealed palace. Ancient sage Yanqing pushed open the door of the palace and walked in. There was an isolation formation within the palace, and in the isolation formation was a massive metal cage. Zhang Xian could not quite tell what material it was made of, but there were runic inscriptions all over it. 2 youths were imprisoned in the metal cage. Upon seeing ancient sage Yanqing, their eyes immediately narrowed in fury. If they could, there was no doubt that they would have killed ancient sage Yanqing. Zhang Xian swiftly assessed the 2 youths and noticed that they were both sempiternal realm consummation experts, just a step away from reaching ancient sage. In terms of disposition and strength, They did not pale in comparison to Yin Shui. Why did you lock them inside the cage? Zhang Xian asked doubtfully. While the 100 schools of philosophers had strayed from Kong Shi's ideal of education without discrimination, Zhang Xian could tell that they were not the type to harm others without any justification. Could those two have committed some kind of heinous crime? Zhang Shi, are you able to tell who they are? Ancient sage Yinqing asked. Hearing that question, Zhang Xian frowned. Based on the other party's words, it seemed like he was expected to know these two youths, so he took a closer look at them. However, he was still unable to figure out their identities, so he eventually shook his head. They are otherworldly demons. Ancient sage Yinqing replied. Those words made Zhang Xian freeze on the spot. They are otherworldly demons? How can that be? Could it be that they are otherworldly demon emperors in disguise? The otherworldly demon's Jinqi of slaughter was so overpowering that it was impossible to disregard it. The two youths standing before him were releasing no killing intent at all, so how could they be otherworldly demons? Could it be that they were otherworldly demon emperors who had used some kind of special means to disguise themselves? But that should not be either. Except for Luo Ruoxin's disguise amulet, there was no disguise that had been able to escape his eye of insight thus far. He was certain that the two youths before him were not disguised. They were in their natural form. I know that you have your doubts, but they are really otherworldly demons. They absorbed the heavy energy earlier and turned into their current states. Ancient sage Yinqing replied. This, Zhang Xian's body shook in astonishment. He was still wondering whether that mercury-like energy could be absorbed or not. But it turned out that it was so powerful that it could even turn otherworldly demons into humans. Was this for real? Who? Without explaining himself, ancient sage Yinqing stepped forward and flicked his wrist. The mercury-like energy from the elevated platform earlier immediately gushed toward the two youths in the cage. In response to the arrival of this unique energy, the two youths did not show the slightest hint of fear. Instead, their eyes lit up in excitement as they swiftly sat down, opened their acupoints, and absorbed the energy. As the energy flowed into their bodies, it immediately began to billow like boiling water. Their aura and energy swiftly grew more and more condensed. It's really possible, Zhang Xian thought as he clenched his fists tightly together. The otherworldly demons were actually able to absorb the mercury-like energy that even he was unable to absorb, and it increased their rate of cultivation a frightening degree. He immediately turned to ancient sage Yinqing, hoping to receive answers about this curious observation from the other party. This has something to do with one's innate constitution. As long as one's innate constitution is sufficiently strong, one will be able to adapt to the heavy energy and assimilate it into one's body. The innate constitution of the otherworldly demons is far stronger than that of humans. Just the fact that they are blessed with the strength of a transcendental mortal at birth speaks volumes. Nevertheless, of the 10 I have experimented on, these are the only 2 survivors. Ancient sage Yinqing said. Furthermore, I have tested this on over 10,000 men over the past year, but none of them survived in the end. Hearing those words, Zhang Xian's face warped in horror. What he was horrified by was not ancient sage Yinqing's callousness, but the significance of what he had just said. He had thought that while otherworldly demons had a head start in front of humans, due to their innate constitution, they would be on equal footing with one another in the later stages. However, it seemed like the rift was much wider than he had thought. If this mercury-like energy one day covered the entire master-teacher continent, would mankind not go extinct, and the otherworldly demons rise in power? Alarmed by this notion, Zhang Xian asked, is this why Kong Shi used ancient sage Ziyuan's corpse to create that massive formation to block the dimension passageway? Is it all to prevent the heavy energy from leaking into this world? That's right. Ancient sage Yinqing nodded in response. When Kong Shi first noticed the Kungsa domain, it was nothing more than an ordinary passageway between the master-teacher continent and the azure. The heavy energy that lingered in it wasn't too great then, but he swiftly realized that while humans would quickly lose their lives upon absorbing it, there was a chance that otherworldly demons could survive the assimilation of the energy and become tremendously stronger as a result of that. That was also how Vicious came about. In order to prevent mankind from being destroyed, ancient sage Ziyuan willingly gave up his life to become the crux of the floating coffin heaven-mending formation that we have now. Nodding in realization, Zhang Xian recalled another thing that he had noticed in the Kungsi domain and asked, "What about the green sprout wheat and the superior constitution of the ordinary populace?" Knowing what Zhang Xian was asking, ancient sage Yanqing replied, "After years of research, Kong Shi found that the main reason why there was a chance for some otherworldly demons to survive the assimilation of the heavy energy was due to their superior innate constitution. This realization highlighted the importance of enhancing the average constitution of humans. But Kong Shi knew very well that the enhancement of an entire race's constitution was bound to be a long battle. It's impossible to make significant advancement within a short period of time. One of the key factors that Kong Shi identified that would effectively enhance the constitution of an entire race was their diet. As such, he entrusted ancient sage Ziqi and his descendants with the responsibility of developing a crop that could achieve this effect. After many years of trial and error, they eventually successfully nurtured the green sprout wheat. This crop has the effect of continuously cleansing and enhancing one's constitution, and after tens of thousands of years of nourishment, there was indeed significant growth in the constitution of the 100 schools of philosophers. Unfortunately, we are still a long way off from matching the constitution of the otherworldly demonic tribe, and we are still unable to directly absorb the heavy energy. Zhang Xian nodded in enlightenment. The doubts that he had harbored previously had all been cleared up. It was no wonder the 100 schools of philosophers had suddenly disappeared from the master-teacher continent. It turned out that they had devoted themselves to protecting the seal in the Kungsi domain, so as to prevent the mercury-like energy from leaking out. At the same time, they viewed it as their mission to nurture stronger humans. Once those in the Kungsi domain were able to adapt to the mercury-like energy, their strength would grow by leaps and bounds. Their means might have been different from the master-teacher continent, but their ultimate goal was the same: the development of mankind. Ancient sage Yanqing continued on. The Kungsi domain is a small world, and the resources that it contains are severely limited. Furthermore, with the strengthening of the average constitution of the general populace, the spiritual energy that we require is growing significantly too. As such, we have no choice but to limit the qualifications to cultivate to just a selected few. This is also why we have so many tests and trials in place. We can only afford to invest our resources in talents who have the potential to reach the top. While ancient sage Yanqing mentioned that the Kungsi domain was a small world, that was only in relative comparison with the master-teacher continent. Its scale comfortably exceeded that of any of the major empires on the master-teacher continent. However, in order to nurture the green sprout wheat properly, the Kungsi domain had to seal off its connection to the master-teacher continent. Thus, it carried the risk of its spiritual energy drying up should there be too many cultivators. In a sense, the Kungsi domain was similar to a greenhouse. No matter how huge the greenhouse was, it could not reach the same level of self-sufficiency as the external world to provide nourishment for any number of plants. In Zhang Xian's previous world, a scientist had once set up a massive greenhouse and placed countless plants, animals, and insects within it as an experiment. However, within less than a year, the entire habitat had completely collapsed. Such was the case for Kungsi domain. Unlike the master-teacher continent, it did not have the ability to fully regulate itself, and the nourishment required to bestow even ordinary humans with the strength of the Zhongshe realm put a huge burden on it. So it was inevitable that they had to limit the number of cultivators. Otherwise, it was likely that the Kungsi domain would first collapse before its people could adapt to the mercury-like spiritual energy from the azure. I believe that you might have noticed it already, but this problem isn't just limited to the Kungsi domain. The master-teacher continent is still safe for the time being, but it'll face the same threat in the future. As the number of cultivators increases, There'll eventually come a day when the spiritual energy dries up, ancient sage Yanqing remarked. Zhang Xian nodded in response. No matter how big or enriching an environment or habitat was, it would have a breaking point where everything started to unravel. In a way, humans absorbing the spiritual energy from the environment was like fleas leaping on a cow. Even 1,000 fleas might not mean much to the cow, but what if there were millions or even billions of them? No matter how strong the cow was, it would eventually collapse under the burden and die. In the face of this practical problem, the 100 schools of philosophers had no choice but to limit the distribution of cultivation resources, granting only the most talented individuals the privilege to cultivate. Perhaps, the master-teacher continent might find itself forced to make the same decision as well in the distant future. Since we're on the topic, is that why the master-teacher continent lost its ability to support the birth of newer ancient sages? Zhang Xian asked. Be it the master-teacher continent or the Wuxia domain, not a single ancient sage had been born from 10,000 years back to before the recent emergence of the Temple of Confucius. Could this possibly be the reason? Well, overpopulation does play a part in that, but it isn't the primary reason, ancient sage Yanqing replied. As you might know, the aeon of ancient sage is the necessary catalyst for any cultivator to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage. However, the aeon of ancient sage is not something that naturally appears in the master-teacher continent, nor the Wuxia domain. Or to be more exact, this entire world doesn't have the ability to create the aeon of ancient sage. It is an energy that is unique to the azure. The sealing of the heavy energy meant that the aeon of ancient sage is unable to flow down to our world anymore. As such, with the birth of more and more ancient sages, it eventually came to a point where it dried out completely. You mean to say that the heavy spiritual energy contains the aeon of ancient sage? Zhang Xian asked with raised eyebrows. He had absorbed a sliver of it back when he was at the mountain range, but as soon as it entered his body, its weight had nearly crushed all of his meridians. This had forced him to seal all of his acupoints. Yet there was actually aeon of ancient sage in it. Perplexed, Zhang Xian quietly absorbed a small bit of it. The mercury-like energy felt as heavy as ever, but upon closer inspection, he did sense a hint of aeon of ancient sage in it. It was just a small amount, but as one absorbed more and more of it, it was only a matter of time before one overcame the great sage bottleneck and rose to become one of the top experts of the master-teacher continent. But that was assuming one was able to assimilate this domineering energy. Given how even he himself was unable to absorb it, he was not too hopeful for the other cultivators. There was no other choice. If we didn't seal the energy from the azure, the otherworldly demons would only have grown stronger and stronger, eventually leading to the eradication of mankind. It was a decision our predecessors made after careful deliberation. It hasn't led to a good outcome, but it's the lesser of two evils, ancient sage Yanqing explained bitterly. Zhang Xian also fell into deep contemplation. There was no denying that the presence of more ancient sages was good news for mankind. But as long as they did not deal with the mercury-like energy, the greatest beneficiary would ultimately still be the otherworldly demonic tribe. As long as the mercury-like energy existed on the master-teacher continent, it was only a matter of time before the scales were tipped in the favor of the otherworldly demonic tribe. Not to mention, there were deities from the azure who could descend through the dimension barrier. The threat that they posed could not be underestimated either. Is it true that the otherworldly demonic tribe are the descendants of the gods, just like the legends depict them to be? Zhang Xian asked out of curiosity. Was it really just a problem in the compatibility of their constitution that meant they were unable to absorb the mercury-like energy, whereas the otherworldly demons were able to? I don't really know the exact answer, but there are written quotes from Kong Shi that suggest that the otherworldly demonic tribe are the descendants of an exiled god tribe. He said that it's due to the scarce spiritual energy on the master-teacher continent that resulted in their severe weakening. And as long as they are supplied with pure spiritual energy, they will swiftly return to their former glory. Speaking up to this point, ancient sage Yanqing suddenly turned to the two caged youths and sighed deeply. These two over there are perfect examples. They were ordinary otherworldly demons when they were first captured. But under the nourishment of the heavy spiritual energy from the azure, they grew so much stronger within less than 10 years. On top of that, their appearances have also become no different from those of ordinary humans. Even the most talented human would have to cultivate for hundreds of years before reaching sempiternal realm consummation. However, those otherworldly demons were actually able to reach such a height within a shorter period of time, just by absorbing and assimilating the heavy spiritual energy. It sure was frustrating. But if deities are able to pass through the dimension barrier to descend upon our world, we should also be able to ascend to the azure through the same way, right? Zhang Xian asked as his heart leaped in agitation. The reason he had gone through so much effort to enter the Kungsa domain was to find the passageway leading to the azure in order to reach Luo Ruoxin. Since there was a passageway above the elevated platform, and the deities were able to pass through, not to mention the fact that the mercury-like spiritual energy leaking out from the void came directly from the azure. Could that actually be the way he had been seeking all along? To be honest, I don't really know. Ancient sage Yinqing shook his head. I see. Then, do you know how Kong Shi left the Kungsa domain to enter the azure? Regarding that, ancient sage Yinqing's face reddened in embarrassment. In truth, most of Kong Shi's direct disciples did not even know of his departure back then, let alone a junior, who came many generations later like him. It's only recorded in the books that shortly after Kong Shi achieved a breakthrough to the Dimension Shatterer realm, he left this world. As for where he went, I'm afraid that it isn't recorded anywhere. However, our historians who investigated the matter deduced that there's a good chance that his disappearance had something to do with this seal. This time, it was Kong Shiyao who answered Zhang Xian's question. Hearing those words, Zhang Xian heaved a sigh of relief. From the looks of it, there was a good chance that the void above the elevated platform was the way into the azure. However, with his current strength, he would not last long surrounded by the mercury-like spiritual energy. Perhaps the minimum requirement to doing so was to first reach the Dimension Shatterer realm. Clearly, the current him still had much to work on. Zhang Shi, pardon me, but I have a question for you. The seal on the Kungsa domain was created by Kong Shi himself, making it impossible for anyone to enter or leave. The reason we were able to enter the Master Teacher continent previously was because we were able to tap into the power of the Temple of Confucius to temporarily breach the seal. So how did you manage to get in here? Ancient sage Yinqing asked with a doubtful frown. This question made the others direct intrigued looks at Zhang Xian. It was an established fact among them that it was impossible for them to enter or leave the Kungsa domain. The emergence of the Temple of Confucius had been the only exception to the rule in the past tens of thousands of years. However, it had been several months since the Temple of Confucius closed, so it should be impossible to exploit this loophole. Given so, how did Zhang Xian manage to get in there? Feeling that there was no reason to hide this matter from them, Zhang Xian replied honestly. While I was visiting the Tianxian kingdom, I found a seal that was centered around ancient sage Ran Qiu. Out of curiosity, I broke the seal, and before I knew it, I was already in the Kungsa domain. Wait a moment, did you say that you broke the seal? You broke that seal? Ancient sage Yinqing and the others shook in agitation. What's wrong? Quick, let's head over to take a look. With no time to explain, ancient sage Yinqing swiftly opened up a dimension rift and leaped in. The others quickly followed suit. In just a moment's time, they had already arrived at where Zhang Xian had entered the Kungsa domain. The seal was still standing firm, but the hole that Zhang Xian and the others had entered through was gradually expanding. They could just about see black flames pressing firmly against the exterior of the Kungsa domain, attempting to force its way in. Zhang Xian was taken aback. What's going on here? He knew just how powerful the seal was, and he had needed to make use of the powerful ordeal of lightning armament in order to open up a small hole to open. Why would there suddenly be such powerful black flames pressing against the seal? Not to mention, They bore an uncanny resemblance to the empyrean heavenly flames. This is the backlash from the heavens, ancient sage Yanqing grimly explained. Backlash from the heavens? While we have isolated the Kungsi domain from the master-teacher continent, it still doesn't change the fact that they are actually one entity. What we are doing here, the cultivation of the green sprout wheat, and the enhancement of the fundamental constitution of mankind, is going against the laws of nature, thus creating a distortion in this world. The reason ancient sage Ranqiu's body was left outside is not just to sustain the seal. More than that, it's to prevent the heavens from peeking in. However, now that the heavens have learned of what we have done in the Kungsi domain, they've sent down divine retribution to punish us and undo what we have done. At this rate, it won't be long before the Kungsi domain is swallowed by the raging flames of the heaven's fury. Ancient sage Yanqing exclaimed worriedly. Zhang Xian's body stiffened. Every world had its own rules, and these rules were enforced by the heavens. Anyone who tried to breach these rules would find themselves faced with the wrath of the heavens. In a sense, this was similar to how cultivators attempting to push for higher realms would have to face heavenly tribulations. Putting everything aside, in his previous world, Wang Meng, being a transmigrator, had attempted to change the world. But in the end, the heavens had sent down the son of the heavens, Lu Xiu, in retaliation, and the latter had easily destroyed everything that he had built. The rules of the world could not be disregarded, and even ancient sages were no exception to the rule. Zhang Xian had thought that the reason no one was able to find the Kungsi domain was due to the lofty 100 schools of philosophers trying to steer clear from the rest of the world. But it turned out that their main goal was to conceal themselves from the detection of the heavens. If people frequently entered and left the Kungsi domain, it was only a matter of time before the heavens detected the existence of the Kungsi domain. Once that happened, everything would be utterly destroyed, be it the green sprout wheat, the 100 schools of philosophers, or even the domain itself. Knowing that this was a catastrophe that he had caused, Zhang Xian turned to ancient sage Yanqing and asked, "Do you have any blueprints of it for me to mend the formation? I'll seal off the Kungsi domain, once to prevent the heavens from peeking in." "We do have the blueprint to the formation, but it's of no use." Ancient sage Yanqing shook his head. "What has been breached isn't just this seal, but the illusory formation that was set up outside too. Previously, if the heavens attempted to peer into the coffin, Kong Shi's body would appear, which would lead the heavens to think that Kong Shi has passed away, thus halting their investigation right there. However, the fact that the black flames have reached this seal means that the illusory formation has been undone. The heavens are already aware of everything. Any reparation work done now will only delay the inevitable." Zhang Xian fell silent. On his way to the Kungsi domain, there had been 2 stone coffins. One of them contained ancient sage Ranqiu's body, and it was used to maintain the illusory formation. As for the second coffin, what Zheng Yang saw was Kong Shi's corpse, whereas what they saw was Zheng Yang himself. It was the breaking of the illusory formation that had brought the seal isolating the Kungsi domain from the master-teacher continent to his attention. With these 2 preventive measures breached, the eyes of the heavens were already fixated on the Kungsi domain. Even if they mended everything right now, it would make no difference at all. Is there nothing that can be done? There's only one way out of this. We have to deceive the heavens once more, like Kong Shi did. Deceive the heavens? Back then, when Kong Shi first developed the Kungsi domain, a hint of the energy contained within leaked out, and it swiftly caught the heavens' attention. It was due to ancient sage Ranqiu's willing sacrifice to sustain an illusory formation that they eventually managed to deceive and placate the heavens. Ancient sage Yanqing said grimly, "There's only one way for us to resolve the problem. We have to find a Dimension Shatterer realm cultivator who is willing to sacrifice himself to die under the hands of the heavens. Using his death as a catalyst, we'll create an illusion of the entire Kungsi domain falling into ruins. While the heavens punish those who have failed to abide by the laws of the world, it would be inaccurate to say that they are a sentient force. As long as our means are sufficiently convincing, there's a chance that we'll succeed." Those words made Zhang Xian's eyebrows shoot up. Be it in the entire master-teacher continent, or the Kungsi domain, there was not a single Dimension Shatterer Realm expert still alive. While his strength paired with the Dragonbone Divine Spear was very close to that of a Dimension Shatterer Realm cultivator, his core was simply too much different from that of a real Dimension Shatterer Realm cultivator. The heavens would see through his disguise easily. I'll do it. I don't have long to live anyway. Even if I'm unable to fully deceive the heavens, I should at least be able to buy some time. Ancient sage Yanqing sighed as he looked at the seal with determination. While my cultivation hasn't reached the Dimension Shatterer realm, it's very close to it. Through igniting my soul and my physical body, I should be able to temporarily draw forth a might comparable to Dimension Shatterer realm cultivators. And perhaps, I might be able to deceive the heavens temporarily through that. Ancient sage Yanqing replied. Ignite your soul and physical body? Kong Shiyao was startled. But once your soul and physical body are destroyed, it will really be the end of you. There would be no way you will be able to come back to life. Upon reaching the blood reincarnation realm, even if one's physical body was torn apart, there was still a chance for one to revive. However, if he ignited his soul and body, he would really die through and through. There was nothing in this world that could bring back a dissipated soul, not even the Aeon of Ancient Sage. I know that, but as long as I can protect the Kungsi domain, my death will not be in vain. Ancient Sage Yanqing replied. As a human ancient sage, he had already resolved himself to sacrifice everything he had for the preservation of mankind. If his death could save many more people, his sacrifice would be worth it. Hold that thought for a moment. Let me take a look and see if there is any other way to resolve this situation. Seeing that ancient sage Yanqing was going to rush over at any moment to give up his life for the greater good, Zhang Xian walked up to the black flames with a frown and tapped his finger lightly on it. Be careful, those are the Empyrean flames, Kong Shiyao shouted in horror. The Empyrean heavenly flame was known to be able to burn down everything in the world. Given how it was able to burn down even the seal created by Kong Shi, the young man was courting death by attempting to touch it directly with his fingers. But before Kong Shiyao could finish her piece, Zhang Xian's fingers had already fallen on the flames. The black flames twisted under the touch of his fingers, reminiscent of an embarrassed bride. It was almost as if the flames were meeting an old flame and trying to flirt with him. Kong Shiyao's cheeks twitched in incredulity at what she was seeing. Why did it feel like anything that Zhang Xian touched would somehow become warped and tainted? Despite being a celestial master teacher, a person of equal standing to her great ancestor, he had a brick that relentlessly struck one's face, and a spear that seemed to fancy tying everything in its path up. Furthermore, while he was fighting with the deity, he had no qualms striking the sensitive regions, be it the eyeballs, the neck, or even the crotch. Anywhere an attack could slip through, one could expect no mercy from him. It was as if he knew nothing of common courtesy, and the current situation only further confirmed her thoughts. Even the heavenly flames that everyone feared behaved in such a lewd manner under his touch. What a frightening man this Zhang Xian was. Ignoring the shocked crowd, Zhang Xian looked at the flames burning at his fingertips and asked, "Little Huohua, did Dao Dao send you here?" Seemingly comprehending Zhang Xian's words, the black flames shook a little. This etched a frown onto Zhang Xian's forehead. Based on the response from the Empyrean heavenly flames, it was clear that they had been dispatched by the heavens to destroy the Kungsi domain. If one viewed the master-teacher continent as a human's body, the heavens would be its immune system. Its role was to destroy all foreign objects and anomalies in order to ensure that everything followed its intended course. The presence of humans with exceptionally powerful constitutions in the Kungsi domain could be viewed as a cancerous tumor, and to the heavens, it was something that had to be destroyed at all costs. Zhang Xian pondered for a moment before slipping out of the hole to return to the master-teacher continent. Up in the sky, ominous clouds were gathering a devastating combo of lightning and flames at a terrifying rate, as if swearing to never rest until the Kungsi domain was utterly destroyed. Under Zhang Xian's protection, ancient sage Yanqing also managed to pass through the hole as well to come to the master-teacher continent. Zhang Xian turned to the old man behind him and asked, "You mentioned earlier that the death of a dimension shatter a realm cultivator can possibly deceive the heavens, right?" That was the concept used for the formation that our predecessors set up back then. Ancient sage Yanqing replied as he passed a jade token over. Zhang Xian took the jade token and swiftly browsed through its contents. Following which, with a flick of his wrist, a human silhouette materialized right in front of him. A deity? No, that's not right. You forged a deity into a soulless metal humanoid? Ancient sage Yanqing was nearly scared out of his wits. The being that had just appeared in front of him was emanating an aura of ancient history. With just a glance, it was apparent that it had reached the dimension Shatterer realm, boasting a strength that was on par with the deity whom they had fought with earlier. To slay a deity from the azure and forge him into a soulless metal humanoid. This was almost blasphemy. Zhang Xian nodded. Since things had progressed to this point, there was nothing for him to hide anymore. He drew his soul out from his body and slipped it into the soulless metal humanoid. With his means, he was still unable to enchant the soulless metal humanoid. Thus, he could only drive it while his soul was within the soulless metal humanoid. This was a good opportunity for him to try his hand and see if it was really possible to imitate what Kong Shi and his direct disciples had done back then to deceive the heavens. Under Zhang Xian's refinement, he had already shaped the soulless metal humanoid to have an extremely high compatibility with his soul. As such, the prerequisites to conduct the process should have already been met. Hong Long. As soon as Zhang Xian's soul slipped into the soulless metal humanoid, the ominous clouds immediately gathered around his body. Everyone's eyes lit up in agitation as they clenched their fists tightly in excitement. It seemed like things were going to work out after all. But a moment later, the ominous clouds abruptly dispersed from Zhang Xian, as if having lost interest in him. What's going on here? Zhang Xian was surprised to see that things were not proceeding in the direction that he had expected. Based on what was stated on the jade token, the appearance of a dimension Shatterer realm cultivators should have drawn the wrath of the heavens upon him. Then, through a carefully designed ploy, he would put on a facade and substitute himself as the Kungsi domain, and eventually, he would die in place of it. But contrary to his expectations, the heavenly retribution was shunning him. This put him at a loss as to what to do. I think I get it. After recovering from a momentary daze, ancient sage Yanqing's eyes widened in realization. With a dismayed shake of his head, he explained, "The soulless metal humanoid you have possessed is a deity from the azure. It isn't an indigenous being of this world, and the heavens are able to sense the difference." Zhang Xian pondered for a moment before nodding in response. Based on what he had seen so far, it seemed like the heavens had double standards. They did not hesitate to punish the indigenous population under their rule, but against foreign beings who exceeded their knowledge, it would hesitate to make a move. The deity that he had forged into a soulless metal humanoid originated from the azure, making him an existence that was anomalous to the world. As such, the heavens of the master-teacher continent were hesitant to make a move on him. It was also for this reason that the two deities did not come under the attack of the heavens despite having slipped through the dimension barrier. If it had been one of the indigenous cultivators of the master-teacher continent, there was no doubt that the heavens would have struck that person with everything they had to reduce them to ashes. Is there anything else we can do? Zhang Xian was rendered speechless. In the end, even though the heavens were said to be impartial and unfeeling to all, the truth was that they were just a bully who feared the strong. For example, even though Luo Ruoxin's very presence posed a huge threat to the world, the heavens chose to only drive her away forcefully, not daring to provoke her through heavenly flames or lightning bolts. That question obviously stumped ancient sage Yanqing. He was silent for a moment before he proposed. Zhang Shi, try leaving the soulless metal humanoid for a moment. He had no idea what they could do either, so they could only give everything a try in hopes that something would work out. Hearing the suggestion, Zhang Xian quickly extracted his soul from the soulless metal humanoid and began to return to his main body. Perhaps due to the heavens sensing that the consciousness within the soulless metal humanoid earlier had departed from it, the heavens began gathering around it once more. But this won't work either. Zhang Xian scratched his hair in distress. He had to be within the soulless metal humanoid to drive it, in order to facilitate the entire process of deceiving the heavens. Given that he was unable to control the soulless metal humanoid remotely, this plan was a flop as well. If this doesn't work, I could try to refine the other corpse of the deity that I have in my storage ring right now. But as Zhang Xian spoke, his voice gradually faded into silence. He did have another deity corpse in his storage ring that he had not refined yet. However, the corpse had to be first refined into a soulless metal humanoid in order to catch the attention of the heavens, but the refinement process was not something that could be accomplished within a short period of time. We can't refine the other soulless metal humanoids in time, and there are no indigenous dimension Shatterer realm experts. What else can we do? Watching the black flames assault the seal to the Wuxia domain relentlessly, Zhang Xian racked his brain at such a ferocious speed that it seemed as if sparks were going to fly from his head. A thought flashed across Zhang Xian's mind. Right, the Library of Heaven's Path. The Library of Heaven's Path represents the will of the heavens. Given so, is it possible for me to use the golden page to bend the will of the heavens? However, there was an issue with this course of action as well. He had used his only golden page to smash the deity summoned by Sovereign Chun Ling back then. Furthermore, the requirements to produce a golden page were uncertain. So far, he only knew that he needed someone to acknowledge him as his teacher and be earnestly grateful to him for his impartation. Nevertheless, he had to give it a try. Thus, he turned to Kong Shiyao and earnestly asked, Are you willing to acknowledge me as your teacher? What? No way. Kong Shiyao replied without any hesitation. Little flames, little heavens. Awkward. Zhang Xian scratched his head. The others who were present there, such as ancient sage Yanqing, were beings who had lived for more than 10,000 years. It would be difficult to win them over in a moment's time, especially given the fact that they had once had a conflict with one another. The same went for Yan Shui. Thus, he deemed Kong Shiyao to be the one that he could most likely win over. Of course, he did not expect that he would be rejected in an instant. In truth, it was understandable why Kong Shiyao was reluctant to take Zhang Xian as her teacher. The fact that she possessed Kong Shi's bloodline and had inherited Kong Shi's lineage meant that she was already standing on the shoulders of a giant. Not even ancient sage Yanqing was qualified to be her teacher, let alone others. It did not make a difference even if the person asking was a celestial master teacher. She admitted that her talent might be beneath that of Zhang Xian, but she had at least this much of pride in herself. This matter concerns whether or not we will be able to resolve the crisis concerning the Wuxia domain, Zhang Xian insisted. Furthermore, I have no plans of accepting you as my direct disciple. You just have to acknowledge me as your teacher. Based on his previous encounters, as long as the other party sincerely acknowledged him as his teacher and was grateful for his teachings, there was a chance that the golden page would form. It did not matter whether the other party was his direct disciple or not. How can me acknowledging you as my teacher resolve the current problem we are facing? Kong Shiyao frowned. If not for the fact that the young man had just slain a deity and saved the 100 schools of philosophers from a huge crisis, she would have thought that he was a scammer. Why don't we do this for now? I'll give you some pointers on your cultivation, and as for whether you are willing to acknowledge me as your teacher or not, I'll leave it up to you. Looking at the swiftly gathering ominous clouds above him, Zhang Xian knew that the heavenly retribution was just moments away from descending. It was clear that time was not on his side, so he had no time to waste convincing Kong Shiyao. Besides, putting aside the fact that he was not willing to reveal the existence of the Library of Heaven's Path, if he had to make Kong Shiyao acknowledge him as her teacher using such a method, it was unlikely for her feelings to be truly sincere. If so, that could affect the chances of the formation of the golden page. Thus, without waiting for Kong Shiyao's response, he began speaking. Flowing in your body is the purest bloodline of Kong Shi in the past 1,000 years. You are able to master any battle technique and cultivation technique in the blink of an eye, and the rate of your cultivation far exceeds that of ordinary people as well. Furthermore, if I'm not mistaken, even though it has only been 3 years since your cultivation has reached sempiternal realm consummation, you have already faced 3 ancient sage ordeals thus far. But you chose to suppress your cultivation instead of pushing straight for a breakthrough. Kong Shiyao nodded as she waited patiently for Zhang Xian to continue on with whatever he was going to say. Nothing that Zhang Xian had mentioned thus far could be considered a secret. Most of those who were close to her knew all of that. Considering Zhang Xian's means as a celestial master teacher, it should not have been too difficult for him to uncover such information. With each ancient sage ordeal you faced, your cultivation did grow stronger, and it will play a vital role in determining whether you are able to struggle free from the restraints of the heavens and achieve a breakthrough to the Dimension Shatterer realm in the future. However, you probably noticed that a problem has arisen as a result of your multiple attempted breakthroughs, Zhang Xian said. The power of the ancient sage ordeal has already melded into your core. Your body still contains traces of the energies from the multiple ancient sage ordeals that you have been through, and this buildup of unassimilable energies eventually became a bottleneck to your cultivation. You challenged the ancient sage ordeal 3 times within the short span of a year 2 years ago, but ever since then, you haven't attempted anything at all. I think it's worth questioning why you chose to delay the 4th ancient sage ordeal for 2 whole years. Based on what I'm seeing, I would say that it's not because you don't want to do it, but because you dare not to. As if Zhang Xian had struck dead on, Kong Shiyao's face turned frighteningly pale. She subconsciously took a step back as she stared at Zhang Xian with eyes enlarged wide. This matter had been the deepest secret in her heart, and she had not dared speak of it. She did not think that a young man whom she had just met would actually expose it in a few moments. When she first reached the sempiternal realm 3 years ago, she had dreamt of emulating her predecessor's greatness and attempted 3 ancient sage ordeals. Her first 3 ancient sage ordeals had been fraught with danger, but she had eventually managed to overcome them with her tenacity. But after the 3rd ancient sage ordeal, to her horror, she found that the energies from the ancient sage ordeals had already seeped into her bones. No matter how she tried to cleanse her body, she was unable to get rid of them. Her gut feeling told her that if she attempted another ancient sage ordeal and allowed the energies scourging her body to continue building up, there was a good chance that her consciousness would be corroded by the energies, causing her to lose herself. In the worst-case scenario, she might even be assimilated to become a part of the heavenly tribulation itself. It was this deep fear that had led to her to stop her breakthrough despite having overcome 3 ancient sage ordeals within the short span of a year. 2 years had passed since then, and she had not managed to find a suitable solution. However, her physical condition had been deteriorating as she began to lose control over the energies scourging her body. She had browsed through countless books, hoping to find a solution to purge her of this trouble, but her efforts were to no avail. However, to hear Zhang Xian pointing everything out spot on at this moment, could it be possible that he had a solution to her woes? As if he was able to read her mind, Zhang Xian chuckled softly. Since I can see through your problem, it goes without saying that I have a solution for it. You should be able to tell that I, like you, have overcome multiple ancient sage ordeals, but I am not plagued by the issue that afflicts you. Kong Shiyao nodded vigorously as the same realization dawned upon her, and hope rekindled in the depths of her eyes. Just like her, the young man standing before her was at the sempiternal realm, but he was actually able to fight on equal footing with Dimension Shatterer realm cultivators. Other than the fact that he was a celestial master teacher, it was likely that he had faced multiple ancient sage ordeals while suppressing his cultivation, or else there was no way he could have become so powerful. If I may, how can my affliction be resolved? If you are really able to solve my problem, I am more than willing to acknowledge you as my teacher. Kong Shiyao exclaimed in agitation. As long as her affliction was resolved, With her foundation of having overcome 4 ancient sage ordeals, she was confident that she would be able to catch up with her ancestor and eventually reach the Dimension Shatterer realm. With such strength, even if problems cropped up with the seal once more, she would have the strength to resolve them by herself. Perhaps, she might even follow her predecessor's footsteps and enter a higher dimension, rising through the ranks. The problem is actually very simple. Unlike the cultivators on the Master-Teacher continent, the energy required to form the cultivation ordeals within the Wuxia domain comes not from the heavens, but the energy existent in the Wuxia domain. As the Wuxia domain was constructed by Kong Shi, this world harnesses his energy within it. To any other cultivator, this fact wouldn't make a difference at all. But unfortunately, you share the same power origin as Kong Shi, which resulted in your inability to expel the energies from the ancient sage ordeal, as well as your gradual assimilation with it. Zhang Xian explained. The Wuxia domain had 2 major seals to prevent the heavens from peeking in, so it went without saying that the ancient sage ordeals that Kong Shiyao had undergone did not come from the heavens. From the looks of it, it was likely that Kong Shi had implemented the system of cultivation ordeals within the Wuxia domain as well. It should have worked out fine for any other cultivator, but that was not the case for Kong Shiyao. While the energies of the ancient sage ordeal came from the same origin, their violent nature rendered her unable to fully control them. At the same time, she was unable to fully remove them as they fused perfectly with her body, thus leading to their gradual buildup with every ancient sage ordeal that she went through. Over time, they formed a threat that she simply could not ignore anymore. What should I do? Kong Shiyao asked worriedly. The realization of the root of the problem made her realize how difficult it would be to cure her of her affliction, and she began to worry if she would be unable to resolve it for life. Well, the solution is rather simple and straightforward as well. All you have to do is challenge the ancient sage ordeal on the Master-Teacher continent. Of course, given your current accumulation, I don't deny that you face a huge danger in doing so. At this current juncture, you have 2 options ahead of you. If you choose not to push for a breakthrough, as your Jinqi further builds up, you will eventually lose your opportunity to make a breakthrough. On the other hand, if you do push for a breakthrough, considering that you have never come into contact with the lightning tribulation of the Master-Teacher continent before, even I am unable to fully predict what will happen as a result of that, Zhang Xian explained with a knowing smile. However, if you acknowledge me as your teacher, I'll teach you a method that will allow you to overcome your ancient sage ordeal with certainty. Seeing that there was no other way out of this, Kong Shiyao decisively kneeled down and kowtowed several times. All right, I'll acknowledge you as my teacher. I hope that you will save me from my plight. Zhang Xian took a look at the Library of Heaven's Path and saw that no golden page had been produced yet. Knowing that Kong Shiyao's feelings were not yet earnest, he sighed deeply and said, Overcoming the ancient sage ordeal on the Master-Teacher continent isn't tough at all. The key lies in that you mustn't think of it as a burden but a family member. You need to love it, care for it, consider its needs, feel its presence, give it your warmth and concern. Kong Shiyao's face twisted in incredulity, and at that very moment, she really wanted to bust the head of the fellow standing before her. Somehow, she felt as if she had just been scammed. Cough cough. Zhang Shi the main point. Even ancient sage Yanqing could not bear looking on. The ancient sage ordeal was one of the greatest crises a cultivator would face. Even with ample aeon of ancient sage, if one did not possess top-notch talent, it would be impossible to achieve a breakthrough. The reason that Kong Shiyao was able to make a breakthrough was partly because she was allocated with a more generous portion of the resources in the Wuxia domain, due to her standing as a descendant of Kong Shi. Even though the aeon of ancient sage had already run out in the other clans, they were still able to preserve a hint of it for her. Even so, every breakthrough that she had gone through was no different from walking on thin ice. One wrong step, and she would have plunged into the abyss of despair. Yet, that fellow was telling her to treat the cultivation ordeal like a family member, and show care and concern for it. Do you take me for a fool? Do you really expect me to accept the nonsense you are spouting over here? It seems like you doubt my words. Zhang Xian shook his head. He turned to the ominous clouds in the sky and grabbed. A lightning bolt was immediately torn away from the heavenly retribution. Kacha! Kacha! The lightning bolt struggled, wanting to escape from Zhang Xian's grasp but to no avail. Zhang Xian stroked the lightning bolt gently and said, "Good boy, good boy." His voice was tender, as if he was calming down an angry pet. In the face of Zhang Xian's soothing strokes, the struggling lightning bolt hesitated for a moment before the tension gradually left its body. Slowly, it seeped through Zhang Xian's skin and entered his body. Kong Shiyao and the others were stupefied by what they had just witnessed. Was this really possible? It had to be a joke, right? See, that's how you do it. Love is the key to everything. Instead of resisting it, you have to embrace and allow it into you. That's how you can win its trust and make it listen to you. Zhang Xian explained as he flicked his wrist, and the bolt of lightning appeared once more. He stroked the lightning bolt lightly, as if coaxing a purring cat lying on his arms. As unbelievable the sight before their eyes was, it raised a doubt in their minds. Was it really possible to overcome the ancient sage ordeal in such a manner? If so, why had no one done so in the past tens of thousands of years? Considering how powerful the cultivation ordeal is, who would dare treat it as a pet? Trust me, nothing will go wrong. Later on, after you summon the ancient sage ordeal, open up all of the acupoints in your body and absorb it fearlessly. You mustn't show the slightest hint of rejection. Remember, you must use your heart to feel the other party, Zhang Xian explained. As long as you are able to do all of this, I guarantee you that you won't face any problem clearing your ancient sage ordeal. Kong Shiyao was still a little worried. No matter how she looked at it, the other party's words simply sounded like pure cow manure to her. Do you not trust me, or do you not have faith in yourself? If you don't believe that you are able to clear your fourth ancient sage ordeal, you should just drop the idea right now and remain a sempiternal realm cultivator for the rest of your life. Zhang Xian waved his hand in disappointment. I have always respected Kong Shi for the great man he was, and I thought that his descendant would be as valiant and fearless as him. I guess it was wrong of me to assume that his descendant would have inherited his courage. Don't bother taunting me, Kong Shi harumphed. Humph, the worst that can happen is death anyway. Let me tell you this. We of the Kong clan have never feared anything before. Fine, tell me what I should do. Seeing that he had managed to goad Kong Shiyao into it, Zhang Xian nodded in satisfaction. He swiftly provided Kong Shiyao with the exact instructions of what she should do after summoning the ancient sage ordeal, though the crux of it was pretty similar to what he had said earlier. After summoning the ancient sage ordeal, she should not resist it. She needed to draw it into her acupoints and meridians, and use her heart to feel it. Hearing those words once more, Kong Shiyao cringed as her goosebumps rose up. Even though it sounded like utter nonsense, she eventually decided to take a leap of faith and go along with. Gritting her teeth, she said, I'll give it a try. Ignoring ancient sage Yanqing's objection, she flew into the air in preparation for summoning the ancient sage ordeal. Don't do it here. Let's find a remote location. Currently, they were right in the midst of the Tianxian kingdom, and if Kong Shiyao summoned the ancient sage ordeal there, everything in the area could very well be annihilated. Thus, Zhang Xian quickly stopped her and urged her elsewhere. They quickly left the area, and a few breaths later, they were standing in the middle of an empty mountain range some distance away from the Tianxian kingdom. Zhang Xian and the others chose to stand at a distance of 20 li away to spectate the process. Ho! Without any hesitation, Kong Shiyao drove the energy in her body to her limits and released the entirety of her aura at once, inducing the surroundings to rumble as if an earthquake was happening. It took a mere instant for her to catch the attention of the heavens. Ominous clouds billowed as the lightning bolts and heavenly flames that had gathered around the entrance of the Kungsu domain surrounded her, ready to tear her into shreds at any moment. What the? It was almost as if she was watching a bean sprout growing insanely huge right before her eyes. Things were definitely not going the way she had expected. Ancient sage Yanqing turned to Zhang Xian and nervously asked, "Zhang Shi, can she really tame and love such a powerful cultivation ordeal? What nonsense are you spouting?" "Of course not." Zhang Xian turned to ancient sage Yanqing and looked at him as if he was a fool. "Of course not?" Hearing such a response, the crowd nearly collapsed on the spot. "Weren't you the one who was trying to convince us just a moment ago that the power of love is omnipotent? How can you be so fickle as to change your mind the very next instant?" "The ancient sage ordeal is the heaven's punishment toward the cultivators," Zhang Xian replied. "A sinner trying to tame an enforcer. How could that be possible? What using one's heart to feel the cultivation ordeal and shower it with love and concern? All of that was just something I spouted on a whim." "Words you spouted on a whim? But Shiryao is facing the ancient sage ordeal. She'll die like this." Ancient sage Yanqing nearly exploded on the spot. Even jokes should have a limit. Kong Shiryao was the only one among Kong Shi's descendants who had a bloodline purity of 8. If he allowed her to die just like that, he would never be able to face his predecessors. "Calm down. I have no intention of leaving Kong Shiryao to die. Just wait and see," Zhang Xian assured the nervous crowd with a confident smile. At that moment, the power building up amid the dark clouds finally reached its tipping point, and ferocious lightning bolts and blazing heavenly flames rained down upon her. Kacha! The sheer amount of energy formed a devastating tower of flames and lightning that shrouded everything within a diameter of several hundred meters. "Damn it! If that fellow is able to do it, why can't I do it too?" Kong Shiryao cursed under her breath as she felt her muscles tensing under the pressurizing might above her. Her Jinqi instinctively bubbled within her body, ready to burst forth to fend off the devastating energy. However, at the very last moment, she forcefully suppressed every last bit of her strength. Screw it all. Just thinking about the smug, knowing smile on his face made her boil with rage. If she really died, she will never let that bastard off even as a ghost. Boom, boom, boom. As the pillar of terrifying energy engulfed Kong Shiryao, everyone in the area closed their eyes in trepidation, not daring to see what was about to happen. They did not think that their hearts would be able to take it if they saw the young lady being torn to shreds under the cultivation ordeal. However, as they waited and waited, there was no desperate cry of agony or anything of the sort. Perplexed, they looked over, and what they saw left them stunned. At that very moment, the young lady was indeed engulfed by heavenly flames and lightning bolts. But instead of desperately trying to resist this destructive energy, her acupoints were wide open as she accepted the energy into her body without any hesitation. Unlike what most had expected, the destructive energy did not cause any damage or explode within her body. It simply sat quietly in her meridians, almost as if it had been domesticated. What in the world had happened? Everyone looked at the young man before them with indescribable looks on their faces. Did he not just say that it was all lies? If so, what was happening? If Kong Shiryao was able to do it, should they give it a try as well? At that moment, the sempiternal realm consummation Shui Yin felt deeply tempted. Zhang Shi, with his curiosity getting the better of him, ancient sage Yanqing asked, "Just what is going on here?" "You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."